I spent 30 blood-soaked years building a $4 million timber legacy for my only son, never imagining his greed would demand my life before my time was up. I never thought my reward for a lifetime of sacrifice would be feeling his hands violently shove me out the open door of a helicopter. As I plummeted toward the freezing waters of the Snake River, he looked down at me, certain my death would bury his sins forever. But he made a fatal mistake. Evil always underestimates the preparation of a hard-working man. He did not know that my lawyer was already waiting in a courthouse holding a crystal-clear audio recording of his entire monstrous confession. The deafening roar of the helicopter rotors faded into a high-pitched scream as the icy wind of the Pacific Northwest tore at my face. Gravity seized me with an iron grip. I was falling fast, plunging through the freezing air toward the dense green timber canopy and the jagged, unforgiving rocks of the Snake River Valley below. My name is John Sullivan. I am 68 years old. As the freezing wind whipped the breath from my lungs, my mind did not flash to some peaceful white light or a montage of happy memories. It flashed directly to my hands. I held them up against the rushing wind and looked at my calloused, scarred palms. The knuckles were permanently swollen from arthritis. The skin was thick, resembling old leather. I had not spent 4 decades dragging my body through mud sawdust and freezing rain building Sullivan timber from a single rusted chainsaw into a $4 million logging empire, just to be murdered by my own flesh and blood. I twisted my body in the terrifying freefall, the icy air stinging my eyes, and caught one last glimpse of the black helicopter banking sharply above me against the gray sky. Bradley. My own son. The boy I had taught to ride a bike. The boy I had carried on my shoulders through those very same woods. He had just looked me dead in the eye, unbuckled my safety harness, and pushed me out the open door to my death. The impact with the freezing, turbulent river was only seconds away, but the true impact, the one that completely shattered my reality and destroyed my heart, had actually happened 3 weeks earlier. I hit the freezing water with the force of a freight train, the cold stealing the last ounce of air from my lungs. But as the dark water swallowed me, my memory violently pulled me back to the exact moment the illusion of my perfect family began to crack. 3 weeks ago, I was just a retired old logger living a quiet, peaceful life, blindly devoted to my son. I was a widower. My beautiful wife, Catherine, had passed away 5 years ago from a brutal battle with breast cancer. Her death left a massive, aching void in my chest that nothing could ever truly fill. After she was gone, I poured every ounce of my soul, my energy, and my love into our only child. I sacrificed my knees, my back, and my youth to the relentless timber industry so Bradley would never have to know the feeling of an empty stomach or the bone-deep chill of an unpaid heating bill. While I was out in the remote camps, swinging axes, operating heavy loaders, and sleeping in damp trailers until my muscles screamed in agony, Bradley was living a life of privilege. I paid for him to attend a pristine, expensive business school on the East Coast. I paid for every semester in cash, wiping my greasy hands on my jeans before writing the checks. I remembered the day Bradley graduated. I had flown across the country, sitting uncomfortably in a middle seat, wearing my only suit. I watched him walk across that stage, believing I was witnessing the culmination of the American dream. My son, the son of a dirt-poor logger, was going to be a titan of industry. I never realized that by shielding him from the harsh realities of manual labor and struggle, I had failed to teach him the true value of a hard-earned dollar. He grew up believing that money was simply a number on a screen, something that magically appeared to fund his desires. When he met Jessica, a woman who wore designer clothes and turned her nose up at anything less than luxury, I did not object. When they wanted a lavish country club wedding with imported flowers, a live orchestra, and a guest list full of people who had never worked a day of manual labor in their lives, I paid for that too. I stood in the back of that country club in my rented tuxedo, feeling out of place, but swelling with immense pride. Jessica only amplified his entitlement. I remembered sitting at their rehearsal dinner, surrounded by her wealthy family. They looked at my calloused hands and simple manners with polite disdain. Bradley had spent that entire evening trying to distance himself from me, ashamed of the man who had paid for the very food they were eating. I had brushed it off then as pre-wedding nerves. I even stepped aside earlier than I planned, handing Bradley the role of vice president of Sullivan Timber. I trusted him unconditionally to lead the company into the future, while I slowly stepped back into a quiet, well-deserved retirement. I truly believed I had done my job as a father. I believed my legacy was secure in the hands of a grateful, intelligent son. That blind, naive faith died completely on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the worn oak table in my modest kitchen, drinking a cup of black coffee and looking at a framed photograph of Catherine. I was thinking about how proud she would be of the man our son had become. Then my cell phone rang, shattering the quiet morning. I looked at the screen. It was Mike Peterson. Mike ran the biggest heavy machinery maintenance and supply yard in the county. He had been servicing my logging equipment, my skidders, and my loaders for over 2 decades. We had built our businesses side by side, relying on trust, mutual respect, and firm handshakes. I answered the phone with a smile, expecting him to ask about a weekend fishing trip we had been planning. But Mike did not sound friendly that morning. His voice was thick with anger stress and a heavy dose of confusion. "John, what kind of game are you playing over there?" he demanded, entirely skipping any pleasantries. I set my coffee mug down on the table, completely thrown off guard by his hostile tone. I asked him what he meant, assuming there had been a miscommunication regarding a recent delivery of hydraulic fluid or spare parts. Mike let out a bitter, exhausted laugh. "I just got a call from my commercial bank, John. The corporate check Sullivan Timber sent me yesterday for the fleet maintenance, the $50,000 invoice for the engine rebuilds, it bounced. The bank declined it for insufficient funds and flagged the account." My blood ran absolutely cold. I stood up so fast my heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the kitchen floor. I told Mike that was entirely impossible. Sullivan Timber was a $4 million enterprise with zero debt. We had massive cash reserves specifically earmarked in our operating accounts for mechanical expenses, employee payroll, and heavy equipment maintenance. I had personally overseen those accounts for 30 years, and we had never, not even during the worst economic recessions, missed a payment or bounced a corporate check. Mike sighed heavily, his anger slowly shifting into a deep, genuine concern for his oldest client. "I am telling you the truth, John." The check bounced hard. "My bank manager called me personally. He said the Sullivan Timber corporate operating account is completely tapped out. It is empty. You need to look into this right now, John, because my parts suppliers are demanding their money by Friday and I cannot carry a $50,000 hole for you. I have my own guys to pay." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, my knuckles turning white. I assured Mike, swearing on my late wife's grave, that he would get his money by the end of the business day. I told him I would personally withdraw it from my private retirement savings if I had to. I hung up the phone and stood completely alone in the quiet kitchen. A sickening, heavy feeling settled deep in the pit of my stomach, spreading like a poison through my veins. A bouncing check of that massive size was not a simple clerical error or a delayed bank transfer. It was a glaring, terrifying red flag. Bradley had assumed total unchecked control of the financial division and the corporate accounts exactly 6 months ago. He was the only one signing those checks now. He was the only one interacting with the corporate accountants and managing the cash flow. I had given him the keys to the kingdom, trusting him to manage the wealth I had literally bled into the soil to create. I rushed to my home office, a small room lined with old filing cabinets and smelling of pine and old paper. I booted up my desktop computer and logged into the read-only portals of the corporate banking system. My hands were shaking so violently I had to type my password 3 times before getting it right. When the main dashboard finally loaded on the screen, my heart stopped beating. The numbers staring back at me made no logical sense. The main operating account, which should have held hundreds of thousands of dollars in liquid assets for the upcoming logging season, showed a balance of less than $300. The payroll reserve account was completely empty. But that was not the worst of it. A new tab had appeared on the banking interface, a tab for commercial credit lines. I clicked on it, my breath catching in my throat. Someone had taken out massive leveraged commercial loans against the company's heavy logging equipment. The skidders, the feller bunchers, the logging trucks, machines that I owned free and clear, had all been put up as collateral for aggressive high-interest cash loans. And the total debt was staggering. Millions of dollars had been quietly borrowed against the company over the last 6 months, and the cash from those loans had vanished entirely from the corporate ecosystem. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring with tears of betrayal and utter disbelief. The $4 million legacy I had built to ensure my family's future was quietly bleeding to death from the inside. We were not just broke. We were drowning in toxic debt, and aggressive private lenders were already circling the waters. I rubbed my eyes, hoping I was having a nightmare, but the cold, hard numbers on the screen remained. The money was gone. The company was on the verge of total collapse, and the only person who had the access, the authority, and the ability to execute this level of financial destruction was my own son. I refused to believe it immediately. A father's love is a stubborn, blinding force. I desperately tried to rationalize it. Maybe Bradley had made a terrible investment mistake trying to grow the company. Maybe he was in over his head and was too proud to ask me for help. I needed to see him. I needed to look him in the eyes and demand the truth before I tore the company apart with a forensic audit. I grabbed my keys, threw on my heavy flannel coat, and walked out to my truck. I was going to drive straight to his pristine, modern office in the city. I was going to demand answers. But as I started the engine, I realized something crucial. If Bradley was truly innocent, if this was just a catastrophic business error, he would have come to me. He would have asked for my help. The fact that he was hiding it, that he was letting $50,000 checks bounce to our oldest friends, meant he was actively concealing a massive fraud. I gripped the steering wheel, my mind shifting gears. I could not just confront him. If I walked into his office screaming accusations, he would immediately know I was onto him. If he was truly responsible for this theft, he would use his corporate authority to lock me out of the systems, destroy the remaining evidence, and leave me holding the bag for the millions in debt he had accumulated. I needed concrete proof. I needed to know exactly where the money went and why he was destroying everything I had built. I put the truck in reverse and backed out of my driveway, my heart heavy with a grief that felt worse than death. The father in me wanted to weep for the boy I had raised, but the blue-collar grit, the iron determination that had allowed me to survive decades in the dangerous timber industry kicked in. I was not going to let my life's work be destroyed, and I was certainly not going to let the men who relied on Sullivan Timber to feed their families lose their jobs because of a greedy, arrogant child. The battle for my legacy had begun, and I was going to fight it with the exact same ruthless precision I used to fell a 100-foot pine tree. Walking into the fellowship hall of the local Methodist church that Sunday felt like stepping into a parallel universe. The large basement room was bathed in the warm, artificial glow of fluorescent lights filled with the comforting aromas of baked ham, green bean casseroles, and fresh peach cobbler. For decades, this weekly potluck had been the cornerstone of my social life. It was a place where honest, hard-working people gathered to share a meal, offer prayers for the sick, and talk about the upcoming timber season. People shook my hand, patted my shoulder, and thanked me for keeping so many local families employed. Sullivan Timber was more than just a company to this town. It was the economic heart of the community. But that morning, the smiles of my neighbors felt distant, muffled by the roaring anxiety in my own head. The bounced $50,000 check from Friday burned in my mind like a hot coal. I carried my cup of black coffee to a quiet corner near the folding tables, trying to calm my racing heart watching the heavy wooden doors at the top of the stairs. Then Bradley and Jessica arrived, descending the staircase like royalty gracing a peasant gathering. My son wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most of my loggers made in a month. His hair was perfectly styled, his smile radiant and practiced. Jessica walked beside him, clutching a designer leather handbag, wearing a pristine beige dress and a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the overhead lights with every movement. They were the picture of devout, wealthy perfection. The congregation naturally parted for them, drawn to their polished charisma. Bradley shook hands with the town mayor, laughed at a joke from the pastor, and played the role of the generous, successful corporate vice president to absolute perfection. Looking at them, you would think they did not have a single care in the world. You would never suspect that the company funding their lavish lifestyle was quietly bouncing checks to local vendors. I stayed in my corner nursing my coffee, watching my son with a sickening sense of unfamiliarity. A father wants to believe the best about his child. Even with the glaring red flags waving in my face, a small, desperate part of my soul wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. I wanted to believe Bradley had simply made a foolish accounting error, a temporary misjudgment that we could fix together. But as I watched him charm the room, I noticed a hollowness in his eyes, a calculated coldness beneath the perfect smile that I had somehow ignored for years. My attention drifted to Jessica. She had cornered a small group of women near the dessert table, including the pastor's wife and the wife of our local bank manager. I slowly moved closer, pretending to examine a bulletin board covered in Sunday school drawings, positioning myself just close enough to hear their hushed conversation. Jessica was speaking in a conspiratorial, exhausted tone, playing the part of the weary wife of a corporate titan. She sighed dramatically, adjusting her expensive bracelet. "It is just so exhausting," she whispered to the sympathetic women. "Bradley works unbelievable hours carrying the entire weight of that company on his shoulders, but his father simply refuses to modernize the compensation structure. We are facing such a frustrating cash flow problem right now. We desperately need a larger estate, something appropriate for hosting client dinners and charity events, but the capital just is not liquid. It is so hard trying to build a modern legacy when John is holding the purse strings so tightly." I stood completely frozen, my calloused fingers gripping my ceramic coffee mug so tightly the handle threatened to snap. The sheer audacity of her words left me breathless. I was paying Bradley a base salary of $300,000 a year, not including the massive quarterly bonuses and the fully paid corporate vehicle. He made more in a single month than I had made in my first 5 years of logging combined. I lived in a modest, paid-off 3-bedroom house and drove a 6-year-old truck. I had handed them the world on a silver platter. Yet here she was, draped in diamonds, complaining to the wives of working-class men that I was somehow starving them of cash. Where was all that money going? If they were struggling with cash flow on that kind of income, and the corporate accounts were completely tapped out, the financial black hole they had created was far deeper and more terrifying than I had ever imagined. I did not confront them at the church. I did not walk over and demand answers in front of the congregation. The blue-collar grit that had kept me alive in the dangerous, unpredictable wilderness of the Pacific Northwest demanded tactical silence. You do not fell a massive rotten tree by swinging an axe wildly at the trunk. You step back, you assess the lean, you clear your escape route, and you strike with absolute, calculated precision. I poured my coffee into the sink, walked out the back door of the church, and drove home in complete silence. The next morning, Monday, I was awake long before the sun rose. I put on my heavy denim work jeans, my steel-toed boots, and my worn flannel jacket. I drove to the main yard of Sullivan Timber. The morning air was freezing thick with a rolling fog coming off the river. I pulled through the heavy iron gates and stopped my truck in the center of the massive gravel lot. Surrounding me were the towering stacks of harvested pine and the enormous yellow steel machines that were the lifeblood of my company. The skidders, the feller bunchers, the heavy transport rigs. I looked at the rusted scratches on the blades and the thick rubber of the tires. I had bought every single one of those machines with blood, sweat, and sleepless nights. They were fully paid off. They were the guarantee that my men would always have jobs, and my family would always have bread. I walked into the main administrative building at 6 in the morning, an hour before the regular office staff was scheduled to arrive. I bypassed the plush, modern executive suite I had built for Bradley and walked straight down the narrow hallway to the accounting department. I unlocked the door and sat in the dark, waiting. At exactly 7, William, our head corporate accountant, walked through the door. William was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 50s. We had worked together for over 20 years. He knew the financial history of Sullivan Timber as well as I did. When he flipped on the fluorescent lights and saw me sitting in the corner chair, he physically jumped, dropping his leather briefcase onto the industrial carpet. "John," he stammered, placing a trembling hand over his chest. "You terrified me. Bradley said you were taking the whole month off to rest." I stood up slowly, closing the office door behind him and locking the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I walked over to his desk, leaned over the laminate surface, and looked him dead in the eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the quiet, dangerous rumble of a storm rolling over the mountains. "William," I said softly. On Friday afternoon, Mike Peterson called me. Our $50,000 maintenance check bounced. He told me the main operating account is empty. I need you to pull the hard copy ledgers for the last 6 months, not the digital summaries Bradley sends out. I want the raw, unedited bank statements, the wire transfer logs, and the corporate credit profiles. I want them printed, and I want them on this desk in 5 minutes. William turned the color of old ash. His eyes darted nervously toward the locked door, then back to my face. A bead of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. "John, you know, Bradley restricted my access to the executive tier accounts back in January. He said it was a new corporate protocol for security. He handles all the high-level cash distributions personally now. If I bypass his security locks, he will fire me. I have a daughter in college, John. Please." I reached across the desk and gripped William by the shoulder. My calloused hand dug slightly into his suit jacket. "I built this company, William," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I signed your first paycheck 20 years ago. Bradley does not own this company." "I do. If you do not print those ledgers right now, you will not have to worry about Bradley firing you, because I will have you arrested for financial complicity before the sun clears the tree line. Print the documents." William swallowed hard, nodded frantically, and scrambled to his computer. His fingers flew across the keyboard, typing in administrative override passwords. The heavy laser printer in the corner of the room roared to life, spitting out page after page of financial history. The sound of the printing seemed to echo in the small room like gunfire. William gathered the thick stack of warm paper, his hands shaking so violently he dropped several sheets. He placed them in a neat pile in front of me, then took a step back, wiping his sweating forehead with a trembling handkerchief. I sat down in his rolling chair, pulled my reading glasses from my flannel pocket, and began to read. The first 10 pages detailed the destruction of our cash reserves. It was worse than skimming. Bradley had not just been taking a little off the top. He had systematically drained the operating accounts, the payroll reserves, and the emergency equipment funds. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled out through continuous, massive wire transfers. I traced the routing numbers. The money was not going into business investments. It was vanishing into offshore holding companies, high-risk, unregulated cryptocurrency exchanges, and private luxury real estate trusts. The sheer volume of the theft was breathtaking. He had bled the liquid cash entirely dry to fund a lifestyle of absolute sociopathic excess. But the missing cash was only the beginning of the nightmare. I flipped to the back of the stack, reaching the commercial credit profiles. I stopped breathing. The numbers on the page blurred, and a loud, high-pitched ringing started in my ears. I felt physically violently ill. "William," I whispered, pointing a scarred finger at the bold black ink on the page. "What is this? Tell me what I'm looking at right now." William began to quietly weep. He took off his glasses and rubbed his face. "It is the equipment, John." He leveraged the equipment. I stared at the paperwork in total, paralyzing horror. Bradley had taken our entire fleet of heavy machinery, the feller bunchers, the logging trucks, the hydraulic loaders, the millions of dollars of equipment that I owned free and clear, and he had used it all as collateral for massive high-interest commercial loans. He had borrowed millions of dollars against the physical assets of Sullivan Timber, and to do it, he had forged my signature on dozens of legally binding corporate proxy forms. I sifted through the loan origination documents. These were not standard loans from our local community bank. Bradley had gone to aggressive, predatory private equity firms and shadow lenders, the kind of ruthless financial institutions that specialized in distressed assets and charged exorbitant interest rates. He had taken the millions in loan cash and immediately lost it in the same offshore black holes that swallowed our operating funds. The terrifying reality of my situation crashed down on me with the weight of a falling redwood. My $4 million legacy was not just gone. It had been transformed into a toxic mountain of debt. The lenders held the liens on everything. If Sullivan Timber missed one single monthly payment on those loans, and we were absolutely going to miss the payments because the cash accounts were completely empty, those aggressive private lenders would execute their clauses. They would march onto my yard with court orders and repossess every single machine. Without the machines, my men could not log. Without logging, there was no revenue. The company would instantly collapse into bankruptcy. Hundreds of loyal, hard-working men who relied on me to feed their children would be thrown out onto the street. My life's work, my reputation, my promise to my community would be annihilated overnight. And the man holding the knife to my throat was the boy I had taught to walk. I sat in the cold, silent office, staring at the forged signatures that mimicked my handwriting perfectly. Bradley had orchestrated the complete financial destruction of my empire so he could buy designer dresses for his wife and play the role of a wealthy elite. But as the initial shock faded, a cold, terrifying question emerged from the financial ruins. Bradley was a greedy, arrogant fool, but he was not stupid. He knew these shadow lenders would inevitably come to collect. He knew the bounced checks would trigger audits. He knew the collapse of Sullivan Timber was mathematically imminent, and that when it happened, the forensic accountants would immediately trace the forged signatures and the wire transfers directly to him. He was facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand larceny, unless he had a plan. Unless he knew exactly how he was going to wipe out the debt, hide his crimes, and walk away with a clean slate before the banks foreclosed on the yard. I took off my reading glasses and looked out the small office window at the massive logging yard. The morning fog was lifting, revealing the rugged, dangerous beauty of the timber country. A place where accidents happened every single day. a place where a falling branch or a slipped gear could end a man's life in a fraction of a second. My son had not just stolen my money. He had built a financial trap that required my absolute destruction to function. He was not planning to face bankruptcy. He was planning to face a tragedy. I carefully folded the ledgers, tucked them inside my flannel coat, and walked out of the office knowing that I was no longer fighting for my legacy. I was fighting for my life. The drive from the dusty lumberyard to Bradley's exclusive gated neighborhood felt like a slow, agonizing death march. My heavy work truck rattled and clanked along the smooth, perfectly paved roads of the affluent subdivision, the loud diesel engine noise feeling entirely out of place among the manicured green lawns and pristine imported sedans sitting in wide driveways. I knew Bradley and Jessica's weekly schedule by heart. Every Tuesday afternoon, without fail, they spent exactly 4 hours at the Oak Ridge Country Club. She had her private tennis matches with the other wealthy wives, and he held court in the men's executive lounge, pretending to be a self-made titan of industry while drinking expensive scotch and smoking imported cigars. I parked my rusted, mud-splattered Ford a block away, pulled my faded canvas baseball cap low over my eyes, and walked toward their sprawling modern estate with a heavy heart and a sinking stomach. I did not knock on the massive front double doors. I simply walked around to the side patio and used the spare key hidden inside the fake decorative rock near the porch. It was a key they only gave me in case the expensive lawn care crew needed emergency access to the sprinkler controls. Stepping into their house was like stepping into a cold, sterile museum. Everything was made of polished glass, brushed steel, and stark white leather. It smelled of expensive designer candles and unearned entitlement. I bypassed the massive living room with its vaulted ceilings and walked straight down the long, quiet hallway to Bradley's private home office. The door was a solid core mahogany slab, and exactly as I expected, it was locked tight with a heavy-duty commercial deadbolt. Bradley had told me months ago that the lock was for corporate security to protect sensitive company data. Now I knew with sickening certainty that it was a vault designed to protect his lies. But my son had forgotten something very fundamental about the man who raised him. Before I was a corporate owner sitting behind a desk, I was a mechanic, a carpenter, and a frontline logger. I have spent my entire adult life taking complex machines apart and putting them back together with my bare hands. A standard residential deadbolt, even an expensive one, is nothing but a simple arrangement of brass pins and tension springs. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a small tension wrench and a standard metal pick tools I always kept handy for working on jammed padlocks and rusted equipment boxes out at the timber yard. I slid the tools into the keyway. I closed my eyes, relying entirely on touch and decades of mechanical intuition. It took me less than 3 minutes to feel the satisfying heavy click of the cylinder turning over. I pushed the mahogany door open and stepped inside the cold room. The office was immaculate and aggressively modern. A massive clear glass desk sat right in the center of the room, completely clear of any paper pens or folders. That was always Bradley's style, hiding his life behind digital walls and password-protected screens. I began to search the room systematically. I went through the sleek filing cabinets, the deep desk drawers, the geometric bookshelves lining the walls. Nothing. It was far too clean. I sat heavily in his expensive, ergonomic leather chair, rubbing my aching temples, trying desperately to think like a criminal. Where do you hide the absolute truth when your entire public life is a carefully constructed lie? My eyes drifted slowly across the room and settled on a large, abstract painting hanging perfectly centered on the wall directly behind the desk. It looked slightly uneven, barely a fraction of an inch off level on the left side. I stood up, gripped the heavy wooden frame with both hands, and pulled it forward. Behind the canvas, carved directly and secretly into the drywall, was a hidden biometric wall safe. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. A fingerprint scanner. I was completely locked out. I took a step back, breathing heavily, feeling a wave of panic start to rise in my chest. But then I looked down at the glass desk again and remembered a crucial flaw in my son's character. Bradley was incredibly arrogant, and arrogant men are fundamentally lazy when they believe they are untouchable. I opened the shallow middle drawer of his desk, pulling it all the way out to its absolute limit. Tucked way in the back, hidden underneath a thick stack of blank expensive embossed stationery, was a small black burner laptop. It was thick, cheap, covered in cheap plastic and entirely out of place in this luxury room. I pulled it out, set it on the glass surface, and opened the lid. The screen flared to life, immediately illuminating the dark room and asking for a password. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long moment. I typed his birthday. Incorrect. I typed his wedding anniversary. Incorrect. I stopped and thought about who my son truly was, what he valued above all else in this world. I typed the word Sullivan, followed immediately by the number 4 million. The screen unlocked instantly, dropping me directly into his digital nightmare. The desktop background was pitch black, cluttered with dozens of encrypted folders and hastily named files. My calloused, oversized fingers moved awkwardly over the small, sensitive trackpad, but I managed to locate and open the main financial directory. What I found inside did not just explain the bounced check from the maintenance yard. It painted a breathtaking masterpiece of absolute financial devastation. There was a master ledger, a massive, endlessly scrolling spreadsheet meticulously detailing every single stolen dollar. Bradley had not simply made a few bad corporate investments trying to grow the timber business. He had taken the millions of dollars from the aggressive commercial loans leveraged against my heavy equipment and flushed them down a bottomless, horrifying drain of illegal high-stakes offshore gambling. I scrolled endlessly through pages and pages of massive wire transfers to unregulated casinos in Macau and underground sports betting syndicates hidden in Eastern Europe. He was dropping $50,000 on single hands of digital cards. He was betting hundreds of thousands of dollars on obscure international sporting events he knew absolutely nothing about. When the staggering gambling losses inevitably began to pile up, sheer panic must have set in. The digital ledger showed that he tried to win it all back in one desperate swing by throwing the remaining borrowed millions into catastrophic, highly leveraged cryptocurrency schemes. He had fallen for phantom digital coins and financial mirages, chasing massive, impossible returns to cover the gaping hole he had dug in our company's accounts. The spreadsheet tracked his total cumulative losses in bright, screaming red font. The numbers were astronomical, defying logic and reason. The $4 million legacy I had built with broken bones, crushed fingers, and frozen mornings in the dense forest was entirely gone. In its place was a towering mountain of toxic, high-interest debt owed to the exact kind of ruthless men who do not send polite collection letters in the mail. I clicked on a subfolder labeled simply Correspondence, and the true violent horror of his situation washed over me like freezing river water. There were dozens of saved email threads and encrypted messages with violent loan sharks and predatory private lenders. The messages were brutal, direct, and terrifying. They were demanding immediate repayment with exorbitant penalties. One email dated just 3 days ago and flagged with high priority stated clearly that if the next installment of $200,000 was not wired by the absolute end of the month, they would legally seize the physical assets of Sullivan Timber and then come after Bradley and his wife personally. My son was cornered. He was a trapped, desperate animal, suffocating under the crushing weight of his own monstrous greed and arrogance. But as I sat there in the sterile silence of his luxury office, reading the violent threats from men who could destroy our lives with a single phone call, a terrifying, icy question gripped my mind. Bradley was an inherent coward. He hated physical confrontation. He hated dirt sweat and any form of danger. Yet when I saw him at the church potluck just yesterday, he had looked completely relaxed, entirely at ease. He was smiling genuinely. He was charming the local mayor and eating potato salad. A man facing imminent physical and financial destruction from loan sharks does not smile like that unless he has an airtight, guaranteed, foolproof way out. I closed the massive spreadsheet, my large hands trembling so violently I could barely control the small plastic mouse. I needed to know exactly how he planned to survive this self-inflicted apocalypse. I scanned the desktop and opened the final hidden folder located in the bottom corner. It was simply labeled Insurance. I double-clicked the folder. Inside were several high-resolution scanned copies of dense legal documents. I opened the first file, and my breath caught sharply and painfully in my throat. It was my own corporate life insurance policy. Decades ago, when my beautiful wife Catherine was still alive, and the company was just beginning to turn a real profit, I had taken out a massive corporate life insurance policy. It was specifically designed to protect the company and secure my family's future, in case a falling widowmaker branch or a malfunctioning heavy chainsaw ended my life prematurely in the woods. The final payout was exactly $4 million mathematically designed to cover all potential corporate liabilities and ensure Bradley would be taken care of for the rest of his life. I had not looked at those specific legal papers in over 15 years, but the document glowing on the screen in front of me was not 15 years old. It was newly updated, freshly printed, and scanned. The digital timestamps at the bottom of the pages were from exactly 2 weeks ago. Bradley had used his unchecked executive authority and his perfectly forged proxy signatures to expedite a complete comprehensive overhaul of the policy and the corporate succession trust. I read through the dense legal jargon, my eyes burning and my vision blurring. He had added a specific, ironclad, heavily worded clause regarding the corporate debt structure. The clause dictated that upon my verified death, the $4 million payout would instantly and automatically be released directly to the creditors to clear any and all outstanding commercial loans tied to Sullivan Timber. The insurance money would instantly wipe away the millions he owed to the shadow lenders before probate even began. Once the massive debt was dissolved, the company would be completely clean, and the remaining physical assets, the massive timber tracts, the valuable land, and the unencumbered heavy machinery would transfer directly to his sole ownership, completely free and clear of any financial burden. I sat perfectly frozen, staring in absolute horror at my own forged signature at the bottom of the final page. It was a flawless forgery. He had practiced it for hours, manipulating the pen, until it looked exactly like the jagged, heavy, unrefined handwriting I had used my entire blue-collar life. The math was devastatingly simple. The logic was absolute and entirely chilling. As long as I was breathing, Sullivan Timber was mere days away from total bankruptcy, and Bradley was days away from federal prison or violent retribution at the hands of his creditors. But the exact second my heart stopped beating, all of his massive problems would magically evaporate. The crushing debt would vanish. The aggressive loan sharks would be paid in full. And he would walk away a wealthy, completely innocent man, perfectly playing the tragic role of the grieving son who bravely took over his beloved father's legacy. He did not just want my money anymore. He needed my blood. He needed me to die, and he desperately needed it to happen before the end of the month, When the lenders finally came to collect their pound of flesh, I slumped back heavily into the ergonomic chair, the cold, glowing screen illuminating the hot tears that were finally beginning to spill over my eyelids and run down my weathered cheeks. The betrayal was absolute, complete, and total. It was a physical, crushing weight, pressing the breath out of my lungs and shattering my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. This was my boy. This was the tiny child I had stayed awake with for 3 days straight when he had a dangerous fever. This was the little boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the small, muddy patch of grass behind our very first tiny rented house. I had willingly sacrificed my youth, my knees, my back, and my own personal dreams to give him the entire world on a silver platter. I had worked through violent sickness and agonizing grief, dragging my exhausted body out of bed in the freezing, relentless rain, just so he would never have to know the harsh, unforgiving reality of poverty. I buried my face deep in my rough, permanently scarred hands and wept openly. I did not cry quietly or politely. I sobbed loudly in the empty, silent mansion, releasing a deep, agonizing, guttural wail of a broken father mourning the death of his only son. Because the innocent boy I raised was truly, completely dead. The man currently wearing his face and walking in his shoes was a sociopathic monster, a greedy parasite entirely willing to slaughter his own father in cold blood to fund a life of meaningless, hollow luxury. I cried for my late wife, Catherine, looking up at the ceiling and thanking God she was not alive to see what the fruit of our unconditional love had ultimately become. I cried for the wasted decades, the missed holidays working overtime, the blind, stupid, unyielding trust I had poured into a bottomless pit of deceit. I sat in that chair for 20 long minutes, letting the pure agony tear through my nervous system. I let it break me down to my absolute bare foundation. But when you build your entire life in the unforgiving timber camps of the Pacific Northwest, you learn a fundamental truth about hitting the ground. You learn that the earth is hard, brutal, and unforgiving, but if you plant your boots firmly, you can use that solid ground to push off and stand back up. The tears eventually stopped. The suffocating sorrow began to recede, leaving behind a cold, burning, pressurized furnace of absolute righteous rage. I wiped my wet face with the rough flannel sleeve of my heavy coat. I held my hands out in front of me and looked at them under the harsh light of the computer screen. They were not the soft, manicured hands of a helpless victim. They were the scarred, thick, unyielding hands of a lifelong survivor. I had fought blinding blizzards, deadly mudslides, and brutal economic collapses. I was absolutely not going to let a spoiled, arrogant, cowardly child destroy my life's work and put me in the cold ground just to save his own miserable skin. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, high-definition digital camera, the exact one I used to take detailed pictures of equipment damage and timber yields at the logging yard. I turned it on and took crystal-clear, high-resolution photos of every single screen. I photographed the master ledgers, the offshore gambling accounts, the violent emails from the loan sharks, the perfectly forged life insurance documents, and the altered succession trust. I meticulously documented every single piece of his murderous, greedy puzzle, ensuring the flash was off and the focus was razor sharp. When I was entirely finished, I closed the cheap plastic laptop, placed it exactly where I had found it, in the back of the shallow drawer, and arranged the expensive embossed stationery perfectly over it, masking its existence. I stood up, walked to the heavy mahogany door, and locked the deadbolt behind me, leaving the room exactly as immaculate, sterile, and untouched as it had been when I arrived. I walked out of that sprawling, deceitful mansion and stepped back into the harsh, freezing daylight of the American wilderness. I climbed into the cab of my rusted truck, gripped the cracked leather steering wheel, and looked toward the imposing iron gates of the country club in the far distance. Bradley thought I was an ignorant, blindly trusting old fool. He looked at my worn boots and calloused hands and mistook my silence for weakness. He was actively planning my funeral, completely unaware that he had just handed a master architect the exact blueprint for his absolute, undeniable destruction. I turned the key, the heavy diesel engine roaring to life and matching the mechanical fury vibrating in my chest. The time for blind, unconditional, fatherly love was permanently over. The time for absolute justice had just begun. The invitation to the Saturday afternoon barbecue arrived as a casual, cheerful text message, a sickeningly normal gesture, masking the absolute nightmare my life had suddenly become. 4 agonizing days had passed since I picked the lock on Bradley's office door and uncovered the catastrophic financial ruin he had secretly orchestrated. 4 days of waking up in a cold sweat before dawn, staring at the ceiling of my quiet bedroom, desperately trying to reconcile the smiling boy I raised with the sociopathic monster who had forged my signature to steal millions of dollars. When I pulled my old mud-splattered Ford truck up to the curb of their sprawling modern estate that afternoon, every instinct in my tired, aging body screamed at me to put the transmission in reverse and drive far away. But the blue-collar grit that had kept me alive in the timber camps demanded I stay. I needed to look him in the eye. I needed to see exactly how a man behaves when he is actively planning the total destruction of his own father. The afternoon sun was beating down on the pristine, perfectly manicured lawns of the exclusive gated community. I walked slowly through the heavy iron side gate, leading to the expansive backyard. The rich smell of expensive smoked meats and imported charcoal filling the warm summer air. The massive stone patio was already crowded with Bradley and Jessica's inner circle, a collection of young, aggressively wealthy corporate executives and their elegantly dressed wives, holding crystal wine glasses and laughing at jokes I would never understand. I wore my usual faded denim jeans and a plain cotton work shirt, feeling like an unwelcome ghost wandering through a luxurious world paid for by my own stolen sweat and blood. Bradley spotted me almost immediately from across the yard. He wore a crisp, immaculate linen shirt and an expensive imported watch that probably cost more than the first commercial logging truck I ever bought. He threw his arms open wide, a practiced, flawless, radiant smile stretched across his handsome face, and loudly announced the arrival of the great John Sullivan to the crowd. He closed the distance and hugged me, clapping my shoulder with a firm, affectionate grip that felt entirely genuine. The sheer absolute audacity of his physical touch made my stomach violently churn. I forced myself to smile back, swallowing the bile in my throat, and played the role of the proud, ignorant old lumberjack to absolute perfection. I shook hands with the local city politicians and the slick venture capitalists, listening in agonizing silence as they loudly praised my son for his brilliant visionary leadership at Sullivan Timber. The hypocrisy was a heavy, suffocating physical weight pressing down on my chest. They were drinking expensive imported scotch, funded by the very violent shadow lenders who were currently threatening to tear my entire life and legacy apart. Jessica was playing the role of the perfect, gracious hostess, gliding effortlessly through the crowd with a silver tray of gourmet appetizers, her expensive diamond jewelry catching the bright sunlight with every movement. But knowing the horrifying truth hidden in that biometric wall safe, the beautiful illusion was completely transparent to me, I watched her closely from the edge of the patio. Beneath her radiant smiles and polite musical laughter, there was a frantic, terrifying, nervous energy vibrating through her entire body. Her eyes darted constantly and anxiously toward the long driveway. Her manicured hands trembled slightly when she poured red wine for the guests. The crushing, suffocating pressure of the violent loan sharks was clearly beginning to fracture her perfectly constructed reality. I endured the sickening charade for nearly an hour, playing the part of the slow, agreeable old man while eating a plate of barbecue I could barely swallow. But the physical and emotional toll of holding back my towering righteous rage was completely exhausting. The loud noise of the party, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, and the hollow, empty laughter became too suffocating to bear. I needed a moment of absolute silence to steady my racing heart and clear my head. I slipped away from the main gathering unnoticed, walking quietly around the side of the massive brick house toward a secluded, shaded stone patio near the service entrance. It was a narrow, cool walkway, lined with tall, dense, decorative hedges, completely hidden from the oblivious guests, enjoying the lavish party on the main lawn. I leaned heavily against the cool brick wall of the house, closing my burning eyes, and focusing entirely on the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The large open bay windows of the sprawling kitchen were directly above my head, slightly cracked open, to let out the intense heat from the massive commercial ovens. I stood there in the quiet shade, trying desperately to figure out how I was going to confront the absolute financial destruction of my legacy without alerting the authorities and triggering an immediate catastrophic corporate bankruptcy that would leave all my men unemployed. Then I heard the voices. They were hushed, frantic, and laced with a terrifying, undeniable panic. The sound drifted clearly and sharply through the open crack of the kitchen window above my head. It was Jessica. Her voice was completely stripped of all its usual polished elegance and calm grace, replaced by a desperate, high-pitched, trembling hiss. "Bradley, you have to do something right now." She was practically crying, the words spilling out of her mouth in a frantic, terrified rush. "They called my personal cell phone this morning, Bradley. They called my private number. They know about this house. They know about my parents in Connecticut. These are not corporate bankers we can negotiate with. They told me if they do not get $200,000 by the absolute end of the week, they are going to send someone to the property to collect it in blood." I stood perfectly still, my breathing completely suspended in my chest. The thick, rough stone of the house felt freezing cold against my sweating back. I heard the heavy, sharp sound of a glass slamming down hard on the marble countertop. Then Bradley spoke. His voice was not panicked. It was not fearful. It was a cold, flat, utterly dead sound that sent a literal shockwave of pure, paralyzing terror straight down my spine. "Jessica, you need to lower your voice and pull yourself together right this second." He spoke with a chilling, detached, sociopathic authority. "Do you want the entire neighborhood to hear you crying like a child? Do you want the old man out there on the patio to hear you talking about the debt?" I pressed my body harder against the brick wall, hiding in the shadows, my large, calloused hands balling into tight, trembling fists. "I do not care about the neighborhood," Jessica sobbed, her voice trembling violently with absolute panic. "I care about violent criminals coming to our home in the middle of the night. You promised me this offshore crypto investment was a guaranteed return. You promised me we would be billionaires living in the Caymans. And now we are completely broke and drowning in illegal toxic debt. We have absolutely zero liquid cash left in any account. How are we going to pay those monsters before Friday?" There was a long, agonizing, heavy silence in the kitchen. I could hear the faint, cheerful sound of the party continuing in the backyard, completely and utterly oblivious to the horrific reality unfolding just a few feet away. "We are not going to pay them on Friday," Bradley finally said, his voice dropping into a low, predatory, terrifying register. "What do you mean we are not going to pay them?" Jessica gasped, her breath catching in her throat. "They are going to kill us, Bradley. They are going to take absolutely everything we have. Just give it a month," Bradley replied smoothly, and the absolute lack of human emotion in his tone was the most terrifying thing I had ever heard in my 68 years of life. "A month?" Jessica cried out quietly, disbelief and terror mixing in her voice. "We do not have a month. They will destroy us in a week. Just listen to me and stop panicking." Bradley snapped his voice sharp, cold, and commanding. The old man's heart is not what it used to be. He has been complaining about his joints, about being tired all the time. He is old, Jessica. He is exhausted. Once he is permanently out of the picture, the new corporate life insurance policy automatically covers every single penny of the outstanding commercial debt. The shadow lenders get paid instantly and automatically upon the legal filing of his death certificate. The massive debt evaporates overnight. Then we quietly sell the unencumbered timber tracts to that commercial developer in Seattle for $10 million in cash, and we are completely in the clear. We move to the islands just like we planned, and we never look back. My blood completely stopped flowing through my veins. The world around me seemed to entirely detach from physical reality. I was standing in the shadows, listening to my own flesh and blood casually summarize the cold mathematical justification for my murder. "But how are we going to do that, Jessica?" whispered her voice, trembling with a sickening mixture of moral horror and desperate, greedy hope. "Bradley, he is incredibly healthy. He works outside in the woods every single day. He is not just going to randomly drop dead from a heart attack in the next 3 weeks. He does not need to have a heart attack," Bradley said smoothly, the chilling words rolling off his tongue with practiced, premeditated ease. "The Pacific Northwest is a rugged, brutal, dangerous place, Jessica. It is incredibly unforgiving to stubborn old men who refuse to retire and sit in a rocking chair. The steep logging roads are treacherous. The heavy machinery is massive and unpredictable. He is out there completely alone in the dense woods all the time, surveying the new timber tracts. I just need him to have an accident out in the woods. A tragic, sudden, completely unavoidable accident." The heavy silence that followed his horrific words was heavier than the massive redwood trunks I used to fell with my bare hands in my youth. I stood in the deep shadow of the house, listening in complete paralysis, as the woman my son married silently accepted this monstrous, bloody proposal. "Are you absolutely sure it will work?" Jessica finally asked, her voice entirely stripped of any moral hesitation or guilt, focused entirely on her own selfish survival and greed. "It is completely foolproof," Bradley assured her, the arrogant, smug confidence fully returning to his smooth voice. "I am the sole legal beneficiary of the trust. I hold all the corporate proxies and emergency power of attorney. As long as the accident looks completely natural and tragic, the insurance adjusters will sign off on the massive payout in 48 hours. I will play the devastated, grieving son, bravely taking over the tragic remains of the family empire. The town will shower us with endless sympathy, and the loan sharks will back off the exact second they see the verified insurance payout pending in the accounts. We just have to act completely normal until the opportunity presents itself. Now wipe your wet face, put on a beautiful smile, and go take a fresh tray of expensive appetizers to the mayor." I heard the sharp clicking of her high heels and his leather shoes walk away from the kitchen window, the heavy swinging door squeaking faintly as they returned to the bright sunshine and the ignorant laughter of the backyard party. I remained completely frozen against the rough brick wall for what felt like an absolute eternity. The warm, summer afternoon air suddenly felt like freezing river water filling my burning lungs. My entire reality, every single sacrifice I had ever made, every broken bone I had suffered, every freezing morning I had endured to build a secure future for my only child, had just been reduced to a violent, calculated insurance scam. I was no longer just a betrayed, heartbroken father facing total financial bankruptcy and the loss of a company. The theft of my life savings and the destruction of Sullivan timber were horrific, unforgivable crimes, but they were fundamentally crimes of greed and arrogance. What I had just listened to, standing outside that kitchen window, was the cold, calculated, remorseless premeditation of my murder. I was actively being hunted by the very boy I had taught to ride a bicycle. He was not just passively waiting for me to die of old age. He was actively planning to orchestrate a fatal, violent accident in the deep, remote woods to slaughter me like a meaningless animal so he could maintain his superficial, hollow life of luxury and designer suits. A profound, terrifying, icy clarity suddenly washed over my racing mind. The heavy grief and the suffocating sorrow that had been paralyzing me for the past 4 days vanished completely, replaced by a towering absolute resolve. The hot tears I had shed alone in his locked office were the very last tears I would ever shed for Bradley Sullivan. The innocent boy I raised was truly dead. The man standing in that kitchen pouring wine was a vicious predator, a rabid dog backed into a dangerous corner, completely and utterly willing to tear out my throat to save his own miserable skin. If I confronted him right now, if I burst through that back door and screamed to the heavens in front of his wealthy friends about what I knew, he would immediately deny it. He would use his massive wealth, his local influence, and his silver tongue to paint me as a confused, paranoid, dementia-ridden old man. He would quickly destroy the hidden digital evidence of the loans, accelerate his murderous timeline, and I would likely end up dead at the bottom of a steep, rocky ravine before the week was even over. In the dangerous, unpredictable, unforgiving world of the heavy timber industry, you survive by respecting the lethal, silent power of the forest. When you are standing directly beneath a massive, rotting tree that is groaning and ready to fall and crush you, you do not stand there and yell blindly at the trunk. You step back silently, you calculate the exact trajectory of the immense danger, and you completely remove yourself from the strike zone before you bring your own axe down on your own specific terms. I pushed myself slowly away from the rough brick wall. I did not return to the crowded backyard. I did not say a polite goodbye to the local politicians, the wealthy executives, or the son who was actively planning my funeral. I walked silently and deliberately down the shaded stone path, slipped quietly through the heavy iron side gate, and walked back out to the quiet suburban street where my rusted work truck was parked. I climbed into the cab, the worn, cracked leather seat feeling incredibly familiar and deeply grounding. I put the metal key in the ignition, but I did not turn it immediately. I sat alone in the quiet, hot cab, staring through the dusty windshield at the sprawling, deceitful mansion across the street. Bradley looked at my faded jeans and my quiet demeanor and thought I was an ignorant, slow blue-collar fool. He thought my calloused hands meant I was weak, trusting, and easily disposed of. He had made the fatal, arrogant mistake of confusing a father's unconditional love with a victim's utter helplessness. He had completely forgotten that a man who spends 40 grueling years conquering the untamed, brutal American wilderness knows exactly how to lay a meticulous trap, how to wait in absolute, unyielding silence, and how to ultimately strike back with a devastating, inescapable, absolute force. I turned the key. The heavy diesel engine roared to life, a deep, powerful mechanical growl that perfectly matched the cold, unyielding iron resolve permanently solidifying in my chest. I pulled away from the pristine curb, leaving the neighborhood of superficial lies and murderous greed far behind me. The time for blind paternal sorrow was permanently over. Bradley wanted to play a dangerous game of life and death in the deep, remote woods, and I was going to make absolutely certain that when the trap finally snapped shut, He would be the one completely crushed in its steel teeth. The drive into town that morning felt entirely different than any journey I had ever taken in my long life. I was not a father going to bail his foolish son out of a minor scrape, nor was I a proud businessman heading to a celebratory corporate lunch. I was an old, betrayed man marching steadily toward a battlefield carrying the exact blueprint of my own family's absolute destruction in my hands. The sky above the Pacific Northwest was a bruised, heavy purple, threatening a massive downpour that perfectly matched the violent storm brewing in my chest. My hands gripped the cracked leather steering wheel of my truck until my knuckles turned completely white. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of Hayes and Associates. Mitchell Hayes was not just a corporate attorney. He was my oldest, most trusted friend in the world. We had known each other since we were both dirt poor, long before I ever bought my first piece of heavy logging machinery, and long before he ever passed the state bar exam. He was a sharp, brilliant, no-nonsense man with a mind like a steel trap and a moral compass that pointed dead true. We had built our respective lives from the ground up, sharing a mutual respect born from decades of hard work and unyielding loyalty. When I walked into his mahogany-lined office, bypassing his surprised secretary with a grim, silent nod, Mitchell took one look at my pale, exhausted face and immediately closed the thick legal files on his desk. He did not ask any polite questions. He walked over, locked his heavy oak office door, and poured 2 glasses of strong black coffee. I sat heavily in the leather chair across from him, pulled the high-definition photographs and the printed ledgers from my coat, and laid everything out on the polished wood. I told him about the bounced maintenance check that had initially shattered my blind trust. I showed him the proof of the forged corporate loans, the millions lost in catastrophic offshore gambling, and the newly updated life insurance policy that practically put a massive financial bounty on my head. I finished by recounting with a trembling voice the horrifying conversation I had overheard on the patio, the casual, cold-blooded plan to orchestrate my fatal accident in the deep woods so my son could cash in on my death and erase his toxic debts. Mitchell did not interrupt me a single time. He listened with the stoic iron discipline of a man who had spent 40 years navigating the absolute darkest corners of human greed and corporate malice. When I finally finished speaking, the silence in the large room was suffocating, broken only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Mitchell took off his expensive reading glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and let out a long, heavy breath. He reached directly for his desk phone, his eyes hard and completely unyielding. He told me we were calling the federal authorities right that very second. He said he had a direct line to a ruthless district attorney who would have Bradley in federal handcuffs before the sun went down over the mountains. But I reached across the desk and firmly stopped his hand. I told him I could not let him make that call. Not yet. Mitchell looked at me with profound confusion, warning me that my life was in imminent, extreme danger. I explained the brutal, unforgiving economic reality of the timber business. A public, chaotic arrest for massive corporate fraud would instantly trigger a wild panic among the aggressive shadow lenders holding the forged notes. The news would hit the local papers immediately. Sullivan Timber's stock would tank completely, and the ruthless creditors would secure emergency court orders to seize our heavy machinery by the end of the week. I looked my oldest friend dead in the eye and reminded him of the hundreds of loyal loggers who worked for me. Those men had broken their backs in the freezing rain to build my legacy. They had mortgages to pay, sick children to care for, and groceries to buy. If the company collapsed in a public, scandalous bankruptcy, those innocent families would lose their livelihoods overnight. I absolutely refused to let my son's sociopathic greed destroy the working-class men and women of our community. We needed a completely different approach. We needed to corner Bradley so completely, so absolutely, that he would be forced into a quiet, immediate legal surrender without dragging the company into a public slaughterhouse. Mitchell slowly lowered the phone, fully understanding the heavy gravity of the situation and the immense responsibility I felt toward my employees. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a gold pen against his leather blotter, his sharp mind rapidly shifting gears from a defensive panic to a highly calculated offense. He explained that if we wanted to bypass a drawn-out public legal war that would bankrupt the company, the circumstantial evidence and the photographs were simply not enough. We needed an airtight, undeniable confession. We needed Bradley to verbally admit to the forgery, the massive theft, and the premeditated murder plot in his own words, completely on the record. Mitchell stood up and walked over to a heavy iron wall safe tucked discreetly behind a framed vintage map of the state. He spun the dial, opened the heavy door, and pulled out a small, sleek, black box. Inside was a piece of technology that looked entirely alien to my calloused working-class hands. It was a high-grade micro-digital audio recorder, the exact kind utilized by private investigators and undercover law enforcement agents for high-stakes corporate espionage. It was no larger than a standard matchbook encased in durable matte plastic, equipped with a tiny, incredibly sensitive microphone capable of picking up a whisper across a noisy room. Mitchell showed me exactly how to operate it, explaining that the specialized battery would last for 48 hours, and the encrypted memory drive could hold weeks of continuous high-definition audio. He asked me to take off my heavy red and black flannel coat, the reliable jacket I had worn into the biting cold of the woods for the last 15 years. With surgical precision, Mitchell took a small razor blade and carefully cut a tiny, nearly invisible slit inside the thick breast pocket. He slid the digital recorder inside the lining, securing it firmly with a small strip of heavy industrial fabric tape. He positioned the microscopic microphone perfectly near the collar seam, so it would remain completely hidden, but pick up every single sound in my immediate vicinity. When I put the coat back on and zipped it up, I could not feel the device at all. But its hidden presence was a heavy, invisible weight pressing directly against my chest. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of my completely broken trust. I was literally wearing a wire to trap my own flesh and blood. Mitchell placed his hands firmly on my shoulders, his expression fiercely serious and deeply concerned. He told me I had to be incredibly careful. I had to play the part of the ignorant, slowing, trusting old man flawlessly. I needed to steer the conversation naturally, ask the right prompting questions, and let Bradley's own monumental arrogance do the heavy lifting. I nodded slowly, buttoning the coat to my chin, feeling a cold, hard resolve solidifying permanently in my veins. I left Mitchell's office with a concrete legal strategy and a powerful weapon hidden in my pocket. I drove back to my quiet, empty house, mentally preparing myself for the absolute hardest, most agonizing performance of my entire life. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat in my worn armchair in the dark living room, staring blankly at the shadows on the walls, mourning the innocent little boy I used to carry on my shoulders through the pine forests. I wrestled with the sheer unnatural horror of what I was about to do. A father is supposed to protect his son from the world, not build the cage that will lock him away for decades. But every time my resolve wavered, I remembered the cold, dead tone in Bradley's voice when he told his wife that my heart was not what it used to be. I steeled my mind against the lingering ghosts of paternal love and braced myself to face the ruthless monster he had chosen to become. The opportunity presented itself much faster and far more terrifyingly than I had originally anticipated. The very next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, the gravel in my long driveway crunched loudly. I looked out the kitchen window and saw Bradley's pristine imported luxury SUV pull aggressively up to the house. I took a deep, steadying breath, slipped my arms into the rigged flannel coat, reached deep into the hidden pocket, and clicked the tiny record button. A very faint, single vibration against my ribs confirmed the device was actively listening and recording. I walked out to the front porch, forcing a warm, oblivious, welcoming smile onto my weathered face. Bradley stepped out of his vehicle, dressed in expensive, brand-new outdoor gear that had clearly never seen a single day of actual hard labor. But it was not his ridiculous clothes that chilled me to the bone. It was his terrifying demeanor. For the past 6 months, he had been perpetually distant, constantly irritable, and highly dismissive of me. Today, however, he was radiating a sickeningly bright, overly affectionate energy. He bounded up the wooden porch steps, smiling widely, and pulled me into a tight, incredibly enthusiastic hug. He clapped me hard on the back, telling me how great I looked, and how much he had genuinely missed spending quality time with his old man. The absolute calculated falseness of his physical affection made my stomach violently churn with disgust. It took every single ounce of my lifelong willpower not to push him backward down the stairs and demand the bloody truth right there in the morning light. But I remembered the crushing hidden debt, the hundreds of innocent loggers relying on me, and the cold metal recorder sitting silently in my pocket. I played along perfectly. I chuckled warmly, patted his shoulder with fake endearment, and invited him inside for a fresh cup of coffee. As we stood in my modest kitchen, Bradley leaned casually against the counter, swirling his ceramic mug, and smoothly dropped the bait. He told me the company had just acquired the exclusive rights to survey a massive, completely untouched timber tract deep in the remote Snake River Valley. He spoke with practiced, breathless excitement, describing the towering ancient pines and the incredible financial potential for the upcoming logging season. Then, looking me dead in the eye with a perfectly crafted expression of pure filial devotion, he invited me to come along with him. He said he had already chartered a private helicopter for the afternoon. He wanted us to survey the raw land together, father and son, just like the good old days, when we used to hike the property lines. He insisted, flattering me endlessly, that my seasoned, experienced eyes were the absolute only ones he trusted to evaluate the true market worth of the timber. My blood stopped flowing entirely. The Snake River Valley was a notoriously dangerous, rugged expanse of unforgiving, brutal wilderness. It was a place characterized by steep, jagged rock ravines, highly unpredictable weather patterns, and treacherous crosswinds that howled through the canyons. It was exactly the kind of isolated, perilous environment where a tragic, sudden, completely unavoidable accident could easily occur without a single witness for 50 miles. The horrifying reality of his cheerful invitation slammed into my chest with the devastating force of a falling redwood. He was not inviting me on a pleasant business trip to look at trees. He was actively inviting me to my own execution. He had clearly accelerated his murderous timeline. The aggressive shadow lenders must have increased their violent pressure over the last 24 hours, forcing him into a desperate corner. He needed the $4 million life insurance payout right now to save his own luxurious skin, and he had deliberately chosen the vast empty sky above the Snake River as the perfect, untraceable place to end my life. I stared at his smiling, handsome face, searching desperately for any tiny trace of hesitation, any minor flicker of human guilt or moral conflict regarding what he was about to do. There was absolutely nothing. His eyes were flat, cold, and entirely devoid of a soul. He was completely and utterly committed to slaughtering his own father before dinner. A wave of profound, agonizing, indescribable sorrow washed over me, immediately followed by a towering, unyielding, righteous rage. He looked at my gray hair and my limp, and thought I was a helpless, blindly trusting fool marching willingly into the slaughterhouse. He thought he held every single card in the deck, and that I was completely oblivious to the blade resting against my throat. I slowly set my hot coffee mug down on the wooden counter, making sure my hands did not shake. I looked at the boy I had raised, the greedy parasite, who was actively planning to throw me out of a moving aircraft, and I smiled back with a warmth I had to dig out of my very bones. I told him I would be deeply honored to join him on the survey. I told him there was absolutely nothing in the world I would love more than to take a beautiful flight over the valley with my only son to see the future of our company. Bradley's smile widened instantly, a brief flash of triumphant, predatory relief crossing his arrogant face. He enthusiastically told me to grab my heavy boots, and that we would head directly to the private airfield in less than an hour. As he turned his back to me and walked out the front door to wait comfortably in his heated car, I reached into my coat and pressed my hand flat against the pocket holding the audio recorder. The trap was perfectly set. The lethal invitation was accepted. I was willingly walking directly into the brutal jaws of death, but I was absolutely not walking in blind. I was going to let him take me high up into the freezing, turbulent air, and I was going to use his own murderous hubris to bring his entire stolen world crashing down around him. The private helicopter was a sleek black machine sitting on the cracked concrete tarmac of the county airfield. Its massive rotors were already spinning when we arrived, cutting through the heavy gray morning air with a deafening rhythmic thumping that vibrated straight through the soles of my heavy steel-toed work boots. Bradley walked ahead of me, his posture completely relaxed, shouting over the mechanical roar about the incredible timber yields we were going to see today. He played the part of the devoted, excited son with absolutely terrifying perfection. I climbed into the cramped passenger cabin and strapped the heavy canvas seatbelt across my chest. The pilot, a young man hired through an anonymous charter company, gave us a quick thumbs up from the front seat before securing the glass doors. Bradley sat directly beside me in the back row. He handed me a bulky aviation headset. His handsome face stretched into a wide, completely empty smile. I put the headset over my ears, muffling the deafening engine noise, and reached deep into the thick flannel pocket of my coat. My calloused thumb found the small plastic button on the micro-digital audio recorder Mitchell Hayes had hidden inside the lining. I pressed it firmly. A single microscopic vibration against my ribs confirmed that the trap was officially armed. Every single word spoken in that cabin was now being permanently captured. The helicopter lifted off the ground, banking sharply against the strong northern crosswinds. Within minutes, the familiar paved roads and suburban neighborhoods of our town disappeared, completely replaced by the vast, unforgiving, rugged wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. We flew high above dense, endless oceans of dark green pine trees. The terrain below grew increasingly hostile, breaking apart into jagged stone canyons and deep isolated ravines. We were heading directly toward the Snake River Valley, a place of brutal, untamed natural beauty, where the freezing water violently carved its way through the ancient stone. It was a place where seasoned loggers disappeared every single year. It was a place where a tragic sudden accident would raise absolutely zero suspicion from the local authorities. I looked down at the freezing white water rushing hundreds of feet below us, and then I looked at the boy I had raised. He was staring out the glass window, completely lost in his own greedy, murderous fantasies. I took a deep, steadying breath. The time for hiding was over. The time for the heartbreaking truth had finally arrived. I pressed the small microphone button on the side of my headset. "Bradley," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any fatherly warmth. You can tell the pilot to turn this machine around right now. We do not need to look at any new timber tracts today." Bradley turned his head, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. His voice cracked through the headset speakers. "What are you talking about, Dad?" he asked, playing the innocent fool. "The new survey coordinates are just 5 miles ahead. This is the biggest commercial deal Sullivan Timber has ever seen. We have to look at the boundaries." I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the cold, unyielding weight of an avalanche slowly breaking loose from a mountain. "There is no commercial deal, Bradley. There are no new timber tracts, and Sullivan Timber is currently holding less than $300 in its primary operating accounts." The confident, arrogant smile instantly vanished from his face. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He stared at me, his eyes wide, his mouth opening and closing silently like a suffocated fish. I did not give him a single second to recover. I leaned closer to him, the helicopter vibrating violently around us, and I systematically tore his entire fabricated world apart. I told him about the bounced $50,000 check for the heavy machinery maintenance. I told him how I had bypassed his executive security locks and ordered a complete hard copy audit of every single corporate ledger. I watched his breathing become shallow and frantic as I laid out the exact details of the aggressive commercial loans he had illegally leveraged against my logging equipment. I recited the names of the violent shadow lenders he owed money to. I described the massive catastrophic losses he had suffered in unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchanges and illegal high-stakes gambling syndicates. "You forged my signature, Bradley," I said, my voice echoing through the headset with absolute righteous fury. "You stole millions of dollars from the company I built with my bare hands. You mortgaged the livelihoods of hundreds of honest, hard-working loggers to fund a pathetic, hollow lifestyle of designer suits and imported cars." Bradley pressed himself hard against the cabin wall, his chest heaving. He tried to deny it. He stammered frantically, claiming there was a massive accounting error, that he had been set up by the financial department, that he could explain everything if we just went back to the office and looked at the numbers together. I cut him off completely. "I do not need to look at any more numbers," I growled. "I broke into your locked home office 4 days ago. I found the hidden biometric safe. I found the cheap black burner laptop hidden under the stationery in your desk drawer. I read every single violent, threatening email from your loan sharks demanding their money by Friday." The moment I mentioned the burner laptop, Bradley completely stopped talking. His panicked stammering died in his throat. He realized with absolute certainty that his financial crimes were entirely exposed. But I was not finished. The audio recorder hidden in my coat was capturing every second, and I needed the final undeniable piece of the puzzle. I needed him to admit to the premeditated murder. I leaned even closer, my shoulder pressing against his. "But the money is not the worst part, is it, Bradley?" I asked, my voice dropping into a dangerous, icy whisper. "The money is just greed. What you are planning to do to me today is something entirely different. I was standing in the shadows outside your kitchen window during the barbecue on Saturday afternoon. I heard every single word you said to Jessica. I know all about the recently expedited life insurance policy. I know that the payout automatically clears the corporate debt upon my verified death. I know that you brought me out here over this freezing river to orchestrate a fatal tragic accident in the woods so you can inherit the remaining assets free and clear." The silence inside that cramped helicopter cabin was suddenly more deafening than the roaring engine. Bradley stared at me. The mask of the terrified, caught child slowly melted away. In its place, a horrifying sociopathic monster emerged, the muscles in his jaw clenched tight. His eyes, usually so bright and charming, turned incredibly dark and completely dead. He realized he was totally trapped. He realized the financial audits would send him to federal prison for decades, and the men he owed money to would likely kill his wife the moment the default became public. He had absolutely nothing left to lose. And in that moment of total cornered desperation, my son finally snapped. He ripped his headset off, abandoning the intercom system, and leaned directly into my face, screaming over the deafening mechanical roar of the helicopter. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not fall to his knees and beg for mercy. Instead, he unleashed a torrent of absolute venomous hatred that he must have been harboring for years. "You forced me to do this, you stubborn old fool," he screamed, his face turning bright red with rage, his spit hitting my cheek. "You have millions of dollars tied up in dirt and rusted machines, and you forced me to wait like a beggar for my inheritance. I am the vice president. I am the future of this company. You should have retired and handed over the keys a decade ago. You just had to keep playing the tough blue-collar hero while my wife and I suffered in a house that was too small, driving cars that were embarrassing to park at the country club." I stared at him in utter disbelief. He was blaming me. He was standing on the precipice of total financial and moral ruin, and he truly believed he was the victim. "I did what I had to do to survive," Bradley yelled, his voice cracking with sociopathic desperation. "I took those loans because I deserve that money. I deserve to live like a king. You made me hate you. You made me resent every single second I had to spend pretending to care about your stupid timber empire. And yes, I changed the insurance policy, because you are worth more to me dead than alive." He had just confessed. Loudly, clearly, and completely unprompted. The digital recorder hidden against my ribs captured every single vile, murderous word. I had exactly what I needed to destroy him legally and save my company. "You are a monster, Bradley," I said, my voice completely devoid of any remaining paternal love. "You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal prison cell." Bradley looked at me, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the small cabin. He looked out the window at the jagged, deadly rocks of the Snake River Valley, hundreds of feet below. He looked at the pilot in the front seat, who was wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones and looking straight ahead, completely oblivious to the horrific family drama unfolding in the back row. Then Bradley looked back at me. I saw the exact moment the murderous calculation solidified in his mind. He realized that if we landed that helicopter safely, his life was completely over. I had the evidence. I knew his plan. The moment the skids touched the tarmac, I would call the authorities and he would be arrested. But if I never made it back to the ground, if I tragically fell from the aircraft during a sudden bout of severe turbulence, he could still execute his plan. He could still claim the insurance money, pay off the shadow lenders, and walk away a wealthy, innocent man. "I am not going to prison, old man," he hissed, his voice dropping into a low, predatory growl that chilled my blood. Before I could react, before my aging, tired muscles could even process the sudden, violent shift in his posture, Bradley lunged at me. He did not hesitate. He did not show a single ounce of human remorse. He reached across the small space between us, his manicured hands moving with terrifying, desperate speed, and he violently slammed his fist directly into the heavy metal release buckle of my safety harness. The heavy canvas straps holding me securely to the seat instantly popped open, retracting rapidly into the bulkhead. I grabbed his wrists, my calloused hands gripping his forearms with the crushing strength of a man who had swung axes for 40 years. "What are you doing?" I roared, fighting to keep my balance as the helicopter suddenly banked sharply to the left. Bradley did not answer. He was completely unhinged, driven by pure animalistic survival instinct. He grabbed the heavy metal handle of the passenger side door. The sliding glass door was not locked. With a violent, desperate shove, he threw the door wide open. The freezing, violent wind of the Pacific Northwest instantly tore into the cabin, roaring like a hurricane. The sudden change in cabin pressure and the massive influx of wind caused the small helicopter to shudder violently. The pilot shouted something inaudible from the front seat, struggling to maintain control of the aircraft as it pitched sideways over the massive river canyon. The open door was directly beside me. There was absolutely nothing between me and a fatal drop into the freezing water hundreds of feet below. I tried to reach for the safety harness, tried to brace my heavy boots against the floorboards, but the violent banking of the helicopter threw my balance completely off. Bradley grabbed the heavy lapels of my flannel coat. His face was twisted into a hideous mask of pure hatred and absolute malice. He looked me directly in the eyes, the son I had sacrificed my entire life for, and he pushed me backward with all of his strength. I felt my center of gravity shift past the threshold of the open door. My hands scrambled wildly, trying to grab the doorframe, trying to grab his expensive shirt, but the heavy winter gloves I was wearing slipped against the smooth metal. "Goodbye, Dad," he screamed over the roaring wind. And then there was nothing beneath my boots. I tumbled backward out of the open door, falling instantly into the freezing empty sky. The deafening mechanical roar of the helicopter above me was immediately swallowed by the violent rushing wind tearing at my ears. I saw the black belly of the aircraft shrinking rapidly above me against the bruised purple clouds. I was falling fast, plummeting like a stone toward the jagged gray rocks and the raging white rapids of the Snake River. The sheer velocity of the fall made it impossible to breathe. The cold wind lashed against my face, stinging my eyes and stealing the breath from my throat. I did not panic. I did not flinch. In those terrifying seconds of freefall, my mind was not clouded by fear, but by a profound, razor-sharp clarity. I had spent my entire life preparing for disasters, mitigating risks, and surviving in one of the most dangerous industries on the planet. I knew how to brace for an impact. I knew how to protect my vital organs. But more importantly, I knew that I had absolutely succeeded. The heavy flannel coat whipped violently around my torso, and I could feel the small, solid shape of the micro-digital recorder secured safely in the waterproof inner pocket. It was still running. It was still recording the sound of the wind, the sound of my fall, and the undeniable, permanently archived confession of the monster who had pushed me. Bradley believed that gravity and the freezing depths of the Snake River were his ultimate saviors. He believed that my broken body washing up on a muddy riverbank weeks from now would be the final chapter of his desperate, murderous plan. He was completely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed my lawyer the ultimate indestructible weapon. The freezing water rushed up to meet me with terrifying speed. The river was a chaotic, churning mass of white rapids and dark, deep pools carving its way violently through the ancient stone canyon. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, tucked my chin down to protect my neck, and squeezed my eyes shut, preparing my aging bones for the brutal, unforgiving impact. I was not just a betrayed father falling to his death. I was the absolute architect of my son's impending doom, and I was going to survive this fall just to watch him burn. The impact with the freezing waters of the Snake River felt like being struck repeatedly by a runaway freight train. The violent crash slammed into my spine instantly, forcing every single ounce of air from my lungs in a violent, involuntary gasp that offered no relief. I distinctly heard the sickening heavy crack of my own ribs snapping before my brain could even register the agonizing pain. The dark, churning water swallowed me whole, violently dragging my heavy body down into a freezing, lightless abyss. The river current was an absolute monster, an untamed beast that tossed my limbs around like fragile broken branches in a hurricane. The icy chill pierced straight through the thick fabric of my heavy flannel coat, biting into my aging skin and freezing my muscles almost instantly. Panic is usually the very first thing that kills a man when he is thrust into the unpredictable wild. I had seen plenty of young, inexperienced loggers freeze up in dangerous situations, letting their terror paralyze their minds until it was far too late to save them. But I had spent 40 grueling years conquering this brutal, unforgiving landscape. I opened my burning eyes underwater, fighting the overwhelming disorientation and the chaotic swirl of white foam. I kicked my heavy steel-toed work boots with everything I had left, completely ignoring the searing, blinding pain that radiated from my shattered ribs with every movement, and fought my way desperately toward the surface. I broke the surface of the river, gasping violently for air, the roaring, thundering rapids completely deafening my ears. I was being swept rapidly and helplessly downstream, surrounded by massive, jagged boulders that threatened to crack my skull wide open with one wrong turn. I used the brutal momentum of the rushing current to my advantage, angling my battered body toward the dense, dark tree line on the right side of the massive stone canyon. Every single stroke of my freezing arm sent a massive shockwave of pure agony directly through my chest. But the burning righteous rage exploding in my heart was infinitely stronger than the freezing water dragging me down. I finally felt the heavy rubber soles of my boots scrape against the slippery moss-covered stones of the shallow riverbed. I dug my scarred, calloused hands deep into the freezing, thick mud and dragged my heavy, soaked body completely out of the treacherous water. I collapsed heavily onto the muddy, freezing bank, coughing violently and uncontrollably, spitting up mouthfuls of freezing river water and tasting my own blood. My entire body shook with violent, unstoppable tremors that rattled my teeth. The lethal cold was already seeping deep into my bones, a terrifying, silent precursor to deadly hypothermia. I carefully rolled onto my back, groaning loudly, as the broken ribs ground together inside my chest. High above me, the black helicopter was already just a tiny, insignificant speck, disappearing rapidly over the distant green tree line. Bradley had not even bothered to circle back to check the water. He was absolutely arrogantly certain that he had just killed me and secured his stolen fortune. I forced myself to sit up in the mud, my fingers completely numb and clumsy from the extreme cold. I reached desperately inside my soaking wet flannel coat, praying with every single fiber of my remaining strength. My thick, scarred fingers finally found the small, waterproof pocket that Mitchell Hayes had carefully sewn into the inner lining just yesterday. I pulled out the micro-digital audio recorder. The small, bright red light was still blinking steadily in the gathering dusk. The heavy industrial-grade plastic housing had perfectly protected the sensitive internal drive from the violent impact and the water. It was completely intact. I pressed the stop button, securely sealing the digital audio file, and carefully tucked the device deep inside my dry inner shirt pocket against my shivering skin. I was freezing to death, severely injured, and stranded completely alone in the middle of absolute nowhere, but a dark, grim smile slowly crept across my bleeding, cracked lips. Bradley truly thought he had silenced me forever in this canyon. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed me the undeniable, indestructible key to his total legal and financial destruction. But simply surviving the initial fall was only the very first step of this nightmare. The Pacific Northwest wilderness is a completely unforgiving environment, especially as the sun begins to set and the evening temperatures rapidly drop well below freezing. I was at least 20 miles from the nearest paved county highway or ranger station. If I stayed sitting on that muddy riverbank feeling sorry for myself, the hypothermia would quietly and efficiently stop my heart long before midnight ever arrived. I had to move immediately. I searched the bank and grabbed a thick, sturdy piece of driftwood, using it as a makeshift wooden cane, and forced my exhausted body onto my feet. The sharp pain in my chest was so incredibly intense, it made my vision blur at the edges. But I gritted my teeth, swallowed the agony, and began to slowly climb the steep, rocky embankment toward the dense, looming timber canopy above. The trek through the darkening, silent forest was a grueling, agonizing nightmare that tested every limit I possessed. The incredibly dense canopy of ancient pine trees blocked out the fading sunlight, completely plunging the deep woods into a disorienting, pitch-black darkness. Every single step I took was a monumental battle for survival. My soaked denim jeans and heavy flannel coat weighed me down like suits of lead armor. The freezing northern wind howled mercilessly through the narrow canyons, turning my wet clothes into rigid sheets of ice that chafed my skin raw. I stumbled repeatedly over exposed, slippery tree roots and slid on patches of damp green moss, my broken ribs screaming in violent protest every single time I tried to catch my balance. But these were my woods. I had spent decades surveying these exact remote valleys, cutting fresh trails, and meticulously mapping the massive timber lines long before Bradley was even born. I did not need a magnetic compass or a modern digital GPS device to find my way out of this trap. As the night sky completely darkened above the branches, I looked straight up through the narrow gaps in the towering pine trees and easily located the North Star. I quickly oriented myself, mentally calculating the exact distance to the old abandoned logging roads I had personally helped bulldoze back in the late 80s. I knew with absolute certainty that there was a specific elevated ridgeline that led directly eastward, pointing straight toward the rural, populated outskirts of the county. The physical agony of the hike was completely relentless. Hours simply blurred together in a confusing haze of freezing cold temperatures and blinding radiating chest pain. I had to stop frequently, leaning heavily and desperately against the rough, sticky bark of the massive pine trees, gasping for shallow, painful breaths that felt exactly like inhaling crushed glass. During those dark, agonizing hours of isolation, the psychological battle was honestly far worse than the physical trauma. The vivid image of my son's handsome face twisted with absolute malice and greed as he violently pushed me out of that helicopter played on a continuous, agonizing loop in my tired mind. I thought constantly about the innocent boy I had raised with so much pride. I thought about the thousands of grueling hours I had worked in the freezing rain to pay for his pristine, elite business school education. I had willingly given him my youth, my health, and my unconditional paternal love. And his ultimate repayment was a violent shove into the deadly abyss just to collect a massive insurance payout. The profound sorrow threatened to break my fighting spirit, entirely tempting me to just lay down in the freezing snow, close my eyes, and simply give up the ghost. But then I thought of my sweet Catherine. I thought of my beautiful late wife and the sacred promises I had made to her on her hospital deathbed to always protect our family and safeguard our hard-earned legacy. She would never forgive me if I allowed a greedy, cowardly monster to completely destroy everything we had built together from scratch. The overwhelming grief vanished instantly, replaced entirely by a cold, highly calculated, and absolute resolve. I pushed myself away from the pine tree, tightened my freezing grip on the driftwood cane, and forced my legs to keep walking. The pure anger became my internal furnace. It warmed my freezing blood and forced my exhausted, trembling muscles to take another painful step, and then another, refusing to surrender to the darkness. Sometime around 3 in the morning, the incredibly dense forest finally began to thin out slightly. I recognized the familiar, jagged, rocky outline of a specific mountain peak standing out against the starry night sky. I had successfully found the old logging road. It was severely overgrown with tall weeds and completely washed out in several steep places, but it was a clear, unmistakable path forward. I followed the winding dirt trail for hours, dragging my heavy boots, my broken body running entirely on pure adrenaline and a righteous, unyielding fury. As the dark sky in the far east began to slowly turn a pale, bruised purple, signaling the rapidly approaching dawn, I finally smelled it. A faint, distant, wonderful scent of burning wood smoke carrying lightly on the freezing morning breeze. I pushed myself to move faster, rounding a sharp bend in the dirt road and finally saw my destination. Nestled quietly in a small cleared area near the very edge of the woods was a sturdy, familiar log cabin with a sloping tin roof. Warm, inviting yellow light spilled beautifully from the small kitchen windows. It was the remote, rural retirement property of Thomas Catherine's older brother. Thomas was a retired state trooper, a tough, hardened, no-nonsense man who had spent 30 long years dealing with the absolute worst aspects of human nature. We had always shared a deep mutual respect, bonded tightly by our infinite love for Catherine and our shared understanding of brutal hard work. I stumbled blindly across the small, frosty clearing, my remaining strength finally giving out completely. I reached the wooden porch steps and fell heavily forward, my bruised knees hitting the solid wooden boards with a loud, hollow thud. I raised my frozen, bleeding right fist and pounded weakly but desperately on the heavy oak front door before my exhausted vision completely faded to absolute black. The very next thing I registered was the intense, radiating, beautiful heat of a blazing cast-iron wood stove. I was lying comfortably on a soft leather sofa, covered securely in 3 thick wool blankets. My wet, freezing, ruined clothes had been completely removed, replaced gently by dry, warm flannel garments. The agonizing, sharp pain in my chest was still very much there, but my broken ribs had been tightly and professionally bound with clean medical bandages. I opened my eyes, slowly, squinting painfully against the bright, glaring morning sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. Thomas was sitting quietly in a heavy wooden rocking chair near the roaring fire, a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee held tightly in his weathered hands. He looked a bit older now, his short hair completely gray, but his dark eyes were just as sharp, alert, and observant as they had always been when he proudly wore the state trooper uniform. When he saw me finally open my eyes, he immediately set the hot mug down on a small table and walked over his lined face, grim and deeply concerned. "John, you stubborn, foolish old mule," Thomas said, his deep voice rough and thick with genuine emotion. "You look exactly like you went 10 brutal rounds with an angry grizzly bear and lost badly. I found you completely passed out on my front porch looking exactly like a frozen corpse. What in the absolute hell happened to you out there in the freezing woods?" I tried to sit up, wincing sharply as the agonizing pain flared instantly in my tightly bound chest. Thomas gently but firmly pushed my shoulders back down against the pillows, telling me strictly to stay perfectly still. I asked him for a glass of water. He quickly brought me a tall glass, and I drank greedily, soothing my raw, parched, and burning throat. I looked slowly around the quiet, incredibly safe cabin, taking a deep, hesitant breath of the warm, dry air. I was actually alive. I had miraculously survived the terrifying fall, the freezing river, and the brutal night trek. Now, it was finally time to deploy the ultimate weapon. "Thomas." I whispered, my voice incredibly hoarse, dry, and broken. "My heavy coat. Where is my coat?" Thomas pointed a finger to a sturdy wooden chair sitting near the hot stove. "It is drying by the fire, John. It is completely ruined. What were you doing out by the river canyon in this terrible weather?" I asked him to bring me the coat immediately. He looked very confused by the urgent request, but he complied without arguing, handing me the heavy, damp garment. I reached carefully into the hidden inner pocket and pulled out the micro-digital audio recorder. I held the small device out to him. "I need you to listen to this right now, Thomas," I said, my voice completely devoid of any remaining emotion. "I need you to listen very closely to exactly what just happened." Thomas took the small black device, his thick brow furrowing in confusion. He pressed the small play button. The quiet, peaceful cabin was instantly filled with the deafening recorded mechanical roar of the helicopter rotors. Then my own voice crackled clearly through the small digital speaker, laying out the undeniable concrete evidence of the forged commercial loans, the offshore gambling accounts, and the massive financial theft. Thomas's eyes widened in absolute shock as he listened to me confront my own flesh and blood. But when Bradley's arrogant voice echoed loudly in the small room, screaming his vile sociopathic confession, justifying his monstrous theft, and proudly admitting to changing the corporate life insurance policy, the color completely drained from Thomas's weathered face. The digital recording flawlessly captured the terrifying, chaotic sound of the physical struggle, the violent metallic pop of the safety harness buckle releasing, and the roaring, howling wind as the helicopter cabin door was forcefully thrown open. It perfectly captured Bradley screaming his final murderous, hateful goodbye as he violently shoved me into the deadly abyss, followed instantly by the terrifying, rushing sound of the wind as I fell toward the river. When the recording finally ended with a click, the heavy silence inside the cabin was absolutely suffocating. Thomas stood perfectly frozen, staring blankly at the small black device resting in his palm, as if it were a live, unpinned grenade. The highly experienced veteran state trooper, a hardened man who had personally seen horrific car crashes, violent murders, and the absolute worst of human society, looked physically sick to his stomach. "That arrogant, worthless, evil piece of trash," Thomas finally whispered, his deep voice trembling with a terrifying, absolute, and unyielding rage. "He literally threw you out of a moving helicopter. He actually tried to violently murder you for a financial payout." Thomas turned abruptly on his heel, marching aggressively across the wooden cabin floor toward a locked heavy steel gun safe sitting in the far corner. He began violently and rapidly spinning the combination dial. "I am going to drive my truck into town right this very second," John Thomas growled, his face turning bright red with uncontrollable fury. "I am going to walk right into his pristine, fancy suburban house, drag him out onto the street by his expensive designer collar, and beat him within an inch of his miserable, pathetic life before I throw him in a dark, concrete cell." I forced myself to sit up, completely ignoring the agonizing, stabbing pain in my broken ribs, and swung my legs off the leather sofa. "Thomas, stop right now!" I commanded, my voice echoing through the cabin with absolute, unyielding, and calm authority. Thomas froze instantly, his hand resting on the safe handle, looking back at me with pure disbelief. "Stop. John, he just tried to brutally slaughter you in cold blood. He is actively planning to steal your entire legacy and leave hundreds of honest good men completely unemployed. I am a retired state trooper. I can call the district attorney right now and have a federal SWAT team kick his pristine front door completely off the hinges before lunch." I looked my brother-in-law dead in the eyes, my expression made of solid stone. "And if you do exactly that, it will become a very public, chaotic media mess," I explained incredibly calmly. "The aggressive shadow lenders will see his dramatic arrest on the evening news. They will instantly panic and legally execute the massive financial liens on all my heavy logging machinery. The company will be completely bankrupted by Friday morning, and all those loyal good men will lose their jobs anyway. We absolutely cannot just arrest him with brute force, Thomas. We have to completely and utterly annihilate him, and we have to do it exactly by the book." Thomas slowly stepped away from the heavy steel gun safe, his large fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He walked slowly back to the warm fire, staring deeply into the orange flames, visibly struggling to contain his righteous, protective, brotherly fury. He looked back at me, seeing the incredibly cold, highly calculated, and absolute determination burning in my eyes, and he finally nodded his head in agreement. "What is the master plan, John?" Thomas asked quietly, sitting back down in the rocking chair. I leaned back against the leather sofa, feeling the immense physical exhaustion settling deep into my aging bones. Bradley fully believes I am dead and broken at the bottom of the freezing river. He is going to rush directly to the probate court to have me declared legally deceased so he can immediately claim the massive insurance money and pay off his violent creditors before they kill him and his wife. We are going to sit right here in this quiet cabin, and we are going to let him dig his own massive grave. We are going to let him commit absolute perjury in front of a sitting judge. And when he genuinely thinks he has absolutely won the game, we are going to spring the legal trap so incredibly hard it will permanently shatter his entire stolen world. The morning sun broke through the frosted window panes of the rural cabin, casting long, pale shadows across the heavy timber floorboards. I sat perfectly still in the worn leather recliner near the wood-burning stove. Every single breath I took was a sharp, burning reminder of the shattered ribs wrapped tightly beneath my borrowed flannel shirt. The physical agony radiating through my chest was intense, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, hollow void where my unconditional fatherly love used to reside. Thomas walked into the small living room, carrying 2 steaming ceramic mugs of black coffee. He set them down quietly on the wooden table and reached for the television remote. We had been waiting in tense, heavy silence for the local noon broadcast. When the screen flickered to life, the local news anchor looked appropriately somber, her voice adopting that practiced sympathetic tone reserved for local tragedies. But it was the live footage that followed that made my blood run absolutely cold in my veins. There was Bradley, my only son, standing on the pristine, manicured front lawn of his sprawling suburban estate, surrounded by a tight swarm of news microphones and flashing cameras. He was dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored conservative suit. His hair was deliberately disheveled, a calculated choice designed to give the perfect public illusion of a man torn entirely apart by sudden, insurmountable grief. Jessica stood right beside him, gripping his arm tightly, wearing a pair of oversized dark sunglasses and clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. Bradley looked directly into the camera lenses, his eyes red and brimming with forced manufactured tears. He delivered a performance so incredibly flawless, so utterly convincing, that it would have won him an award in any theater in the entire country. He spoke with a trembling, choked voice describing the private helicopter survey over the remote Snake River Valley. He talked about how we were simply admiring the pristine timber tracts, sharing a beautiful, rare bonding moment between father and son, when a sudden violent crosswind hit the aircraft out of nowhere. He wept openly as he described the chaotic turbulence, the terrifying sudden dip of the chopper, and the tragic, completely unavoidable malfunction of my safety harness. He told the gathered reporters that he tried desperately to grab my hand, that he screamed my name in absolute terror as the howling wind pulled me out of the open door, but he was just a fraction of a second too late. He bowed his head, letting a single tear fall down his cheek, playing the devastated broken air to absolute perfection. Thomas gripped the edge of the wooden coffee table so hard his thick knuckles turned completely white. He let out a low, dangerous, guttural growl, cursing Bradley's name, and threatening to drive his heavy pickup truck straight through that manicured front yard to drag my son out into the street by his expensive collar. I placed a calm, steady hand on my brother-in-law's trembling arm. I did not yell at the television screen. I did not throw my hot coffee mug against the cabin wall. I simply sat in the quiet, rustic room and watched the sociopathic monster I had raised tell the entire world how much he loved the hard-working father he had just violently shoved into a freezing abyss. Bradley was not just putting on a dramatic show for the local community to gain their sympathy and avoid suspicion. He was actively setting the stage for a highly calculated, desperate legal maneuver. We did not have to wait long to see his true, greedy motives fully exposed to the light of day. The very next morning, the cheap burner phone Thomas had discreetly purchased for me in town buzzed loudly on the kitchen counter. It was Mitchell Hayes. My oldest friend and brilliant corporate lawyer had been busy pulling every single string and calling in every favor he had at the county courthouse. Mitchell's voice came through the small plastic speaker, sharp, intensely focused, and laced with absolute, undeniable disgust. He told me that Bradley was not even waiting for the official search and rescue teams to drag the freezing river for my broken body. He was already moving with terrifying, ruthless, and greedy speed. Bradley's high-priced defense attorneys had just filed an emergency petition in the county probate court. They were aggressively demanding that the sitting judge declare John Sullivan legally dead in absentia immediately. Normally, declaring a missing person legally deceased without a physical body takes years of exhaustive investigations, police reports, and mandatory waiting periods. But Bradley was citing extreme, catastrophic, and highly unusual circumstances. He had submitted sworn affidavits from the anonymous charter pilot, a man whom he had undoubtedly paid off or manipulated heavily, testifying to the absolutely unsurvivable nature of the massive fall into the freezing, turbulent rapids. But the most sickening, truly depraved part of the emergency petition was his justification for the extreme legal rush. Bradley claimed under oath that Sullivan Timber, the beloved local company I had built with my own blood, sweat, and calloused hands, was facing an imminent, catastrophic financial crisis. He argued passionately in his filings that without an official owner to authorize the immediate release of the massive corporate life insurance policies and the emergency trust funds, the company would default on its commercial loans by the end of the week. He had the absolute staggering audacity to stand before a court of law and claim he needed total unchecked control of my $4 million estate right this exact second to prevent mass layoffs and save the jobs of hundreds of innocent, hard-working loggers. He was using the very men whose livelihoods he had secretly mortgaged to high-interest shadow lenders as a human shield to expedite his massive murderous theft. He knew the violent loan sharks were rapidly closing in on him and Jessica. He knew his time was completely running out. He desperately needed that official death certificate signed by a judge by Friday to trigger the insurance payout and save his own luxurious hollow life. Mitchell Hayes paused on the other end of the telephone line, waiting for my emotional reaction. He offered to march down to the courthouse that very afternoon, present the indestructible digital audio recording directly to the district attorney, and have Bradley arrested for attempted murder and wire fraud before the emergency probate hearing even officially began. It was an incredibly tempting offer. The vivid thought of seeing Bradley in federal handcuffs, completely stripped of his custom-tailored suit, and his arrogant pride was a powerful, intoxicating desire that burned in my chest. But I looked out the cabin window at the rugged, unyielding, and brutal wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. I thought about the towering, centuries-old pine trees outside, how they managed to withstand brutal freezing winters and violent storms, not by reacting quickly, but by possessing deep, unshakable roots and absolute, unyielding patience. I told Mitchell no. I told him we were absolutely not going to stop the emergency probate filing. We were going to sit back in total silence and let Bradley dig his own massive grave so incredibly deep that he would never ever be able to climb his way out. Mitchell understood my strategy instantly. He was a master legal tactician, and he saw the absolute devastating genius of the trap I was proposing. By allowing Bradley to proceed completely unchallenged with the emergency petition, we were letting him willingly and eagerly commit multiple counts of severe, undeniable perjury. Every single legal document his expensive lawyers filed, every sworn statement he personally signed regarding my tragic accidental death, was another heavy iron nail permanently driven into his coffin. He was voluntarily documenting his own massive fraud on the official undeniable public record. We spent the next 3 hours on the phone meticulously planning the precise formation of our counterattack. Mitchell would not file a single objection to the emergency hearing. Instead, he would use his established legal standing as my longtime corporate counsel to attend the proceedings under the guise of a concerned interested party. He would sit quietly in the back row. He would let Bradley confidently take the witness stand. He would let him weep crocodile tears in front of the honorable judge. He would let him swear on the Holy Bible that he had watched his beloved father accidentally fall to a tragic death. And then only when Bradley was completely, utterly, and legally committed to his monstrous lie, Mitchell would spring the trap with absolute devastation. We needed this to be an airtight, cinematic legal ambush. There could be absolutely no loopholes, no aggressive plea deals, and no secret escape routes for my son to wriggle out of. Mitchell assured me he would coordinate quietly and discreetly with a highly trusted federal prosecutor. He knew personally a man who despised corporate corruption. He would ensure that armed federal law enforcement agents would be waiting silently in the wings of the courthouse when the truth was finally unleashed. Mitchell even requested the exact technical specifications of the micro-digital recorder I had in my pocket, ensuring he had the correct cables and adapters to plug it directly into the courtroom's official public address system. For the next 48 hours, I remained completely isolated in Thomas's remote cabin, preparing myself mentally and physically for the absolute hardest, most agonizing day of my entire life. Thomas became my dedicated nurse and my silent guard, carefully changing the tight medical bandages around my broken ribs and forcing me to eat hot, hearty meals to rapidly regain my physical strength. I spent hours sitting silently by the roaring cast iron stove, staring deeply into the flickering orange flames, burying the very last remaining fragments of the blind, unconditional paternal love I had once held for my son. I mourned the innocent, happy boy he could have been, but I hardened my heart completely and permanently against the vicious, greedy predator he had willingly chosen to become. I practiced walking across the heavy wooden floorboards without relying on the driftwood cane, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain in my chest. I absolutely refused to let Bradley see me as a weak, broken, defeated old man when I finally stepped out of the shadows to confront him. I was a logger. I was a lifelong survivor of the brutal American wilderness. And I was returning to civilization not as a grieving, heartbroken father, but as the absolute unyielding instrument of karmic justice. The storm of his own making was rapidly approaching, and I was bringing it directly to his pristine, deceitful doorstep. The modern American county courthouse was a massive, imposing structure of polished marble, dark mahogany, and cold steel. It felt entirely devoid of any warmth or humanity, making it the absolutely perfect stage for my son to perform his final, monstrous act of betrayal. I was not sitting out in the main public gallery. Thomas and I were standing in complete silence inside a small, shadowed witness observation room, just to the right of the judge's elevated bench, looking out through a narrow pane of thick privacy glass. I watched Bradley and Jessica walk slowly down the center aisle, playing the role of the utterly devastated, heartbroken couple to absolute sickening perfection. They were dressed in somber, incredibly expensive black designer clothing. Jessica held a pristine white lace handkerchief, occasionally dabbing at her dry eyes and letting out soft, practiced sniffles, while Bradley kept his head bowed low. His shoulders slumped in a highly manufactured display of unbearable, crushing grief. To the dozens of people sitting quietly in the gallery, including the town mayor and several of my own loyal logging foremen, who had taken the morning off to pay their respects, My son looked exactly like a broken, traumatized man crushed by a sudden tragedy. I stared at him through the glass, feeling a cold, righteous fury completely replace the blood in my veins. He was not mourning my death. He was silently, greedily celebrating his massive financial victory. He had hired 3 of the most ruthless, expensive corporate lawyers in the state, slick, arrogant men in tailored suits who were currently arranging thick stacks of forged financial documents and expedited life insurance claims on the plaintiff's table. They were moving with a terrifying, calculated speed, eager to finalize the massive theft before anyone could ask any difficult questions. The honorable judge, a stern, gray-haired man with decades of hardened experience on the bench, adjusted his gold-rimmed reading glasses and looked down at the towering stack of emergency petitions. I could hear every single breath, every rustle of paper through the courtroom audio feed piped directly into our small room. The judge spoke with a tone of respectful, heavy solemnity, addressing my son directly. He stated clearly for the public record that the circumstances surrounding the helicopter accident over the treacherous Snake River Valley were highly unusual and deeply tragic. However, the judge noted that considering the sworn signed affidavits from the charter pilot and the severe immediate financial distress currently threatening the survival of Sullivan Timber, the court was fully prepared to grant the emergency motions. The judge picked up his heavy silver fountain pen, unscrewing the cap with a slow, deliberate motion. He was literally seconds away from signing the official legal decree that would permanently declare me dead in absentia. That single stroke of ink would instantly unlock my $4 million estate release, the massive corporate life insurance payout, and grant Bradley total unchecked legal authority to dissolve the company, sell the timber tracts, and pay off his violent shadow lenders. I watched my son's face incredibly closely. Beneath the fake, sorrowful expression, I could clearly see the greedy, arrogant anticipation practically vibrating in his clenched jaw. He truly thought he had absolutely won. He thought he had outsmarted a foolish, trusting old logger and successfully secured a lifetime of unearned luxury built directly on my watery grave. I turned to Thomas, who was gripping the brass door handle with white knuckles, his face red with contained rage, and I gave him a single definitive, silent nod. It was time to tear my son's stolen, deceptive world completely apart. Right as the judge touched the sharp metal tip of his pen to the thick legal parchment, the heavy oak double doors at the very back of the main courtroom swung wide open. The loud, echoing thud made absolutely everyone in the gallery turn their heads, instantly gasping in collective surprise. Mitchell Hayes walked down the long center aisle with the slow, deliberate, and terrifying calm of an apex predator cornering its trapped prey. He was carrying a single slim leather briefcase, his posture unyielding, and his expression made of solid stone. He did not look at Bradley. He did not spare a single glance for Jessica. He kept his sharp, intelligent eyes fixed entirely on the judge sitting behind the high bench. He approached the wooden dividing railing and cleared his throat, his deep, highly authoritative voice cutting through the thick, suffocating silence of the massive room. "Your Honor," Mitchell announced, projecting his words so powerfully they echoed off the high marble ceilings. "I am Mitchell Hayes, Senior Corporate Counsel for John Sullivan. I am filing an immediate formal objection to the declaration of death and the execution of this estate." Bradley shot up from his leather chair as if he had been physically struck by a massive bolt of lightning. The fake, polished grief instantly melted from his handsome face, replaced entirely by a sudden, frantic, wide-eyed panic. His high-priced lawyers scrambled frantically, knocking over files, and immediately shouting loud objections, citing strict emergency protocols, and aggressively attempting to block Mitchell from approaching the bench. but the judge forcefully banged his wooden gavel, silencing the panicked defense team with a harsh, unyielding glare. The judge looked down at Mitchell, asking strictly on what legal grounds he dared to interrupt a closed emergency probate hearing. Mitchell did not flinch or take a step back. He calmly set his leather briefcase on the wooden table, snapped the brass locks open with a loud click, and looked directly at Bradley with a cold, merciless, terrifying smile. "I am objecting, Your Honor," Mitchell said, with absolute ringing clarity, "because I possess new, irrefutable, and highly disturbing physical evidence regarding the exact nature of the tragic accident that supposedly claimed my client's life." I watched through the privacy glass as my son's arrogant, untouchable facade completely and permanently shattered. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving him looking exactly like a terrified ghost, suddenly forced to face the absolute certainty of his own imminent, undeniable destruction. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as Mitchell Hayes reached into his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out the micro-digital audio recorder. He did not say another word to the defense table. He simply turned to the court bailiff and handed him a small auxiliary cable, instructing him quietly to connect it directly into the central public address system of the courthouse. The judge watched with a heavy, skeptical brow, but allowed the unprecedented motion to proceed. Bradley was practically vibrating with a mixture of arrogant rage and rising panic. He leaned over to his lead attorney, whispering frantically, his face completely flushed. Jessica clutched her pearl necklace, her pristine facade beginning to show severe hairline fractures. Mitchell pressed the small play button. For a fraction of a second, there was only a low hiss of static. And then the massive speakers mounted on the courtroom walls erupted with the deafening, unmistakable mechanical roar of the helicopter rotors. The sound was so incredibly loud and immersive that several people in the public gallery physically ducked in their seats. Over the rhythmic thumping sound of the helicopter blades, my own recorded voice cut through the cold air of the courtroom. I laid out every single undeniable detail of the forged commercial loans, the offshore gambling accounts, and the horrific premeditated murder plot involving the updated corporate life insurance policy. But it was not my voice that completely shattered the room. It was the terrifying sociopathic response that followed. His own arrogant voice echoed off the marble walls, screaming his vile confession for everyone to hear. He justified his massive financial theft. He screamed about how he deserved the money, how he hated me for making him wait for his inheritance, and how he was entirely willing to sacrifice my life to clear his toxic debts. The people in the gallery gasped out loud. The town mayor covered his mouth in absolute horror. The judge sat perfectly frozen, his pen hovering uselessly over the emergency declaration. Then came the chaotic, terrifying sounds of the physical struggle. The loud, metallic pop of the safety harness buckle being forcefully unclasped. The violent roar of the freezing wind rushing into the cabin as the side door was thrown open. And finally Bradley screaming his cold, murderous goodbye right before the sickening rush of air marked my fall into the deadly abyss. When the audio recording clicked off, the silence that followed was heavier than a concrete vault. It was a suffocating, absolute silence that completely stripped away every single lie my son had ever told. Jessica turned absolutely ghost white. All the color drained from her perfectly manicured face, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified shell. She dropped her designer handkerchief, her hands shaking violently, realizing instantly that her luxurious life built on stolen money was permanently over. Bradley stood up slowly, his knees literally knocking against the heavy wooden table. He began to stutter, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence. He looked at the judge, then at his expensive lawyers, searching desperately for a loophole, an excuse, a way to manipulate reality. But his lawyers were already physically stepping away from him, completely abandoning a sinking ship. His entire stolen world evaporated into thin air in a matter of seconds. That was the exact moment I chose to make my entrance. The heavy oak double doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a loud, defining thud that echoed like a cannon shot. Every single head in the room turned simultaneously. I walked slowly down the center aisle. I was heavily bruised. My face bore the deep purple and yellow marks of the freezing river impact. I was leaning heavily on a thick wooden cane, but my spine was completely straight. Thomas walked right behind me, his posture radiating the protective, dangerous energy of a veteran state trooper. The collective gasp from the gallery was deafening. Some of my loyal loggers actually stood up, crying out in absolute disbelief and profound relief. I kept my eyes locked directly on the boy I had raised. Bradley stared at me as I approached the dividing railing. He looked exactly like a man witnessing an actual ghost returning from the grave to drag him to hell. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He realized that the battered, exhausted old logger he had thrown away like garbage had somehow survived the impossible fallout, smarted his perfect criminal plan, and orchestrated his total public destruction. The judge did not hesitate for a single second. He slammed his wooden gavel down with furious authority, immediately ordering the court bailiffs to detain Bradley. But Mitchell Hayes was always one step ahead. Because of the digital recording and the mountain of forged financial documents Mitchell had quietly submitted to the district attorney early that morning, federal authorities were also waiting. The heavy side doors of the courtroom opened, and 4 armed agents marched directly toward the defense table. They grabbed Bradley, violently twisting his arms behind his back, and locked heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He was placed under immediate federal arrest for attempted murder wire fraud and grand larceny. He began to sob pathetically, begging for forgiveness, but I simply turned my face away. The agents then moved directly toward Jessica. She screamed hysterically, crying that she was innocent and knew nothing about the murder plot. But the federal prosecutor had already reviewed the evidence. She was placed in handcuffs and arrested as an accessory to the massive financial crimes. They dragged them out of the courtroom, completely stripping away their arrogant dignity. I stood there leaning on my cane, listening to the heavy steel doors close behind them. The painful, agonizing battle was finally over. The crushing toxic debt was frozen. The hundreds of families relying on Sullivan timber were completely safe. I had lost a son, but I had successfully protected the legacy I had built. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closing behind my son did not just signal the end of a chaotic trial. They marked the absolute and definitive end of a long, terrifying nightmare. The federal justice system moves with a cold, mechanical precision when it is handed an airtight, recorded confession. Bradley and Jessica were completely stripped of their pristine, arrogant illusions within a matter of days. The high-priced corporate lawyers who initially tried to defend them quickly abandoned ship the exact second they heard that digital audio tape play over the speakers. They were left with absolutely nothing but court-appointed defenders and the crushing, inescapable reality of their own monstrous greed. Bradley was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sitting judge looked him dead in the eye during the sentencing and called his actions a chilling display of sociopathic entitlement. Jessica received 15 years as an active accessory to wire fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. All of their luxury assets were immediately seized by the federal government. The sprawling modern estate, the imported luxury cars, and the designer jewelry bought with my stolen money were entirely liquidated. As for the aggressive shadow lenders who had threatened to tear Sullivan timber apart, they were legally paralyzed. Mitchell Hayes presented the perfectly forged signatures and the recorded admission of fraud directly to the federal district attorney. The millions of dollars in offshore loans were declared completely null and void due to the extensive criminal forgery. The ruthless creditors could not touch a single machine on my logging yard. The terrifying mountain of toxic debt that Bradley had secretly built evaporated into thin air, leaving my company safe and unburdened. The recovery of Sullivan Timber was a monumental task, but I did not have to face it alone. Taking back full, total control of the company felt like breathing clean mountain air for the first time in an absolute eternity. I walked back into the main administrative building and immediately removed every single trace of Bradley from the executive suite. But the deep, profound betrayal had permanently shifted my perspective on wealth and legacy. I realized that blindly handing an empire over to a single heir simply because they share your blood is a dangerous and foolish gamble. I looked out the large office window at the massive yellow machines and the towering stacks of harvested pine. I watched the hundreds of loyal, hard-working men covered in sweat and sawdust operating the heavy equipment. Those men were the true heart and soul of Sullivan Timber. They were the ones who actually bled and broke their backs in the freezing rain to build the $4 million fortune. I called Mitchell Hayes and ordered him to draw up the necessary legal paperwork for a complete corporate restructuring. I transformed Sullivan Timber from a sole proprietorship into a fully employee-owned cooperative. I transferred the majority of the company stock directly to the loggers, the mechanics, and the frontline workers who had stood by me for decades. I ensured that the men who actually worked the land would be the ones who inherited its massive bounty. It was the absolute best decision I ever made in my entire life. The morale in the lumberyard skyrocketed. The men worked with a new, fierce pride, knowing they were finally building their own futures and not just lining the pockets of a wealthy owner. 3 months after the sentencing, I found myself sitting quietly on the wide wooden porch of my modest home. The bruised purple sky of the Pacific Northwest was slowly shifting into a brilliant, bright orange sunset. The cold evening wind carried the familiar, comforting scent of pine needles and damp earth. Thomas, my loyal brother-in-law, sat in the rocking chair next to me, holding a steaming ceramic mug of black coffee. Mitchell Hayes sat on the porch step smoking a rare, celebratory cigar. We were not talking much. We were simply enjoying the profound, peaceful silence that comes after surviving a brutal, violent storm. I looked at my calloused, scarred hands resting on my knees. I had sacrificed my youth, my health, and my body to provide an easy life for a son who ultimately tried to murder me for a payout. It is a harsh, agonizing reality to accept that blood does not guarantee loyalty or unconditional love. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones holding the sharpest knives behind your back. But I also learned that absolute integrity and meticulous preparation guarantee survival. Evil people always make the fatal, arrogant mistake of underestimating the quiet strength of a hard-working man. They mistake patience for ignorance, and they mistake gray hair for weakness. They never realize that a man who spends 40 years conquering the untamed American wilderness knows exactly how to tear down a threat and rebuild his life from the ground up. I lost my only biological son to greed and malice, but I gained something infinitely more valuable. I found true, absolute peace. I found a new, chosen family in the loyal men who stood by my side when the entire world was collapsing. As I sat there watching the sun dip below the massive green tree line, I knew my late wife Catherine would be deeply proud of the choice I made. My legacy was no longer a mountain of money waiting to be stolen. My legacy was a thriving community of honest working men and a life lived with unwavering, unyielding honor. I took a deep breath of the freezing evening air. I felt the powerful, steady beat of my own heart echoing inside my chest. The broken ribs had healed, and the deep, lingering emotional wounds were slowly closing every day. I survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I came out stronger on the other side. Justice is a beautiful force when you have the patience to let it work. Karma has a very funny way of working its way through the world. We spend our entire lives trying to build a safe harbor for the people we love, pouring our own blood and sweat into the foundation so they will never have to know the bitter taste of true struggle. But sometimes that absolute devotion blinds us to the rot growing right inside our own homes. Evil people, especially the ones who wear custom-tailored suits and hide behind practiced, perfect smiles, always make the exact same fatal miscalculation. They look at a pair of calloused hands, a slight limp, and a quiet, agreeable demeanor, and they immediately mistake that fatherly patience for pathetic weakness. They mistake an old man's willing, peaceful silence for complete ignorance. My son thought he held every single card in the deck because I never raised my voice or challenged his arrogant authority at the dinner table. He truly believed that because I built my wealth in the mud, the freezing rain, and the rugged timber camps, I lacked the sophisticated intelligence to see through his massive financial web of lies. But the universe demands balance, and you always reap exactly what you sow in this life. When you plant seeds of absolute betrayal and water them with violent sociopathic greed, you will eventually have to harvest a bitter, devastating crop of total personal ruin. Bradley thought he was throwing off a heavy burden when he violently shoved me out of that helicopter high above the freezing river. He never realized until the cold steel of the federal handcuffs locked around his wrists that the very man he violently pushed away was the absolute only thing keeping him from hitting the unforgiving ground. He destroyed his own safety net just to steal the expensive fabric it was made of. Now, I sit on my front porch, listening to the northern wind rustle through the massive pine trees, and I know that my life's work is finally secure. It is no longer tied to biological blood that turned completely toxic, but to the honest, hard-working men and women who actually value integrity and loyalty over easy, stolen money. Justice took its time, but when it finally arrived, it swept the board entirely clean and left me with a profound, lasting buzz. Did you like my story today? Which state or city are you listening from right now? I always take the time to read through your responses, and it brings a genuine warm smile to this old logger's face to see exactly where all of you wonderful people are tuning in from across the world. Let us meet in the comments below and share our thoughts on this journey. If you deeply connected with this story of a father fighting for absolute justice and protecting his hard-earned legacy from pure greed, please support me by dropping a quick like and subscribing to the channel. Sending a super thanks is a beautiful way to support this channel so I can keep bringing more powerful life lessons and true stories exactly like this one directly to your screen. Right now, you can see 2 new stories popping up that I highly recommend you watch next. They carry the exact same heart and the same relentless pursuit of the truth. Thank you for your sweet support. See you in the next one. With love and respect.